Chapter 341. A large pillar of light descended from the sky. The moment the light enveloped the world tree, the frozen battlefield turned even more silent. The Federation, the humans, and the parasites all turned their attention to the top of Tiggle Fortress. It couldn't be helped. The imposing, magnificent scenery unfolding before them was not something anyone could ignore. Not to mention, there wasn't a single being present who didn't know the meaning of this phenomenon. Whoa! The pillar of light slowly subsided. At the same time, the shining tree began to grow at an exponential rate. The weak, straw-like branches shot out like spiderwebs, the withered trunk thickened rapidly, and green leaves grew from the once emaciated branches. Pot! The diminishing light scattered in the sky and on the ground. Now revived, the avatar of the world tree revealed itself to the world once again. It was no longer the pitiful wilted tree it was before. The giant world tree stood proudly as it propped up the sky and overlooked the battlefield. Rumbly. As the world tree finally stretched out its limbs, a terrifying tremor erupted. Here comes the hero Tilda. Sensing the change that would soon come, Russell smiled brightly. Chalk! She clapped. The frost on the ground completely melted away into a liquid, seeping into the black land. The dead earth underwent a change. The reddish-black dirt softened to a pale brown color, seeds germinated and saplings sprouted up. Plants and vegetation grew distinctively, dyeing the earth with a refreshing iridescent light. Flowers bloomed on the battlefield filled with despair. Woo! The screams of nests suddenly rang out on the silent battlefield. The world tree had revived at a time when the infestation was nearly finished. With it purifying the land as soon as it revived and applying pressure in return, the nests were writhing in pain. A stark contrast existed between the spectators of this sight. The army commanders became lost for words. Impossible. Vulgar chastity. The 7th Army commander. Exploding patience. Lost. And abhorrent charity, all reacted in the same way. The world tree blooming once more signified that the 4th and 7th Army commanders had retreated from the spirit realm. Setting raging temperance aside, twisted kindness, who was the strongest existence second only to the parasite queen, lost. It was too difficult to believe. And that made it all the more shocking. However, they had no choice but to believe it, especially seeing the glowing lights gradually gather in front of the world tree and form into 20 or so figures. It was because the figures were all shaped like humans. Ah! Ah! A sky fairy screamed. It was not a scream of despair, but an impassioned cry from an overflowing joy. So he did it in the end. Chinzia showed a rare, full smile. Whoo! Gabriel breathed out a deep sigh and plopped down while the dwarves cheered in excitement. But no matter how happy they were, could they be happier than this race? Yu-jin was kneeling on the ground, staring at the fluttering, glowing lights with a dazed face. The banquet of lights illuminating the sky did not just invite the sky fairies, but also the cave fairies. The lights falling down on the hands of the cave fairies, including herself, was clear, undeniable proof. Ah! She doubted her eyes at first, but soon she felt her strength leave her body and something new enter the empty body. Yu-jin grabbed the cloth covering her eyes with trembling hands. A grotesque pair of pitch-black eyes was revealed. But even that only lasted a moment. Soon, the black color quickly faded away and was replaced by the eye's original, lovely amber color. Only then did a streak of tears run down her face. It wasn't just Yu-jin. Every cave fairy was crying with their head down and their eye cover off. The spirit kings have forgiven us. While everyone was crying silently, Yu-jin raised her voice and shouted. Lord Afinu Oder has withdrawn her sword. Our god. Lord Diffidum Oder is coming back. A deafening shout overflowing with emotion burst out. Despite the resonance phenomenon affecting her greatly,
She felt like she wouldn't be able to tolerate not saying this out loud.
Hick. Teresa didn't say anything. She simply stared at the figures forming in front of the world tree with tearful eyes. Then, she sniffled once again. He really kept his promise. Sol Ji-hoo had told her to buy just a little bit of time. That he would save the spirit realm and return after reviving the world tree. He had kept his promise wonderfully. While everyone tried to stop him, saying it was impossible, he had pulled through in the end. However, Teresa soon snapped out of her daze. If it were up to her, she would have run up to him and poured him 1,000 kisses. Unfortunately, the war was still going on. The world tree reviving meant that the sky fairies would regain their powers. As her lineage shared the bloodline of the sky fairies, she had some knowledge regarding the resonance phenomenon. Spirit resonance. Temporary exhaustion experienced by fairies when they first connected to their spirits. It didn't last long. Perhaps 5 or 10 minutes, at best. But in a fierce battle, 5 minutes was not a short time. Teresa gripped her longsword. I have to buy time. With this, the stage for a counterattack was set. All she had to do was buy time for them to be able to step onto it. No matter what. Asterisk. Sol Ji-hoo quietly studied his body as he felt his consciousness return. The body that had scattered away in the spirit realm was slowly being reconstructed in the middle world. Eventually, his eyes lit up as he looked forward. Due to standing at the summit of the fortress, the entire battlefield entered his view. It doesn't look like we're too late. Cho Hong simpered with a thorn of steel placed on her shoulder. It was just as she said. Tiggle Fortress had not fallen yet. Seeing as how traces of the enemy could be seen in the central area, the fortress must have been pushed to the brink of collapse. However, they had managed to revive the world tree before then. Wah! A loud, thunderous cheer erupted. As the heroes who revived the world tree appeared, the pent-up emotions inside everyone had burst out. The war wasn't over yet. In fact, it was only starting now. But everything they had achieved up to this point was not meaningless. Soon, the results would show for themselves. Sol Ji-hoo closed his eyes within the deafening cheer. Now there was only one thing left to do. Quang! The corrupted throne broke. The parasite queen shot up after slamming down on the armrest. Despite having expected as much, her eyes were filled with fury as she stared at the battlefield. The parasite queen barely managed to swallow her breath just as she was about to blurt something out. I expected as much. Right, she had expected this. The appearance of humanity, the revival of the world tree, and the sky fairies regaining their powers as a result. Although she hoped it would not happen, she had predicted this situation as the worst-case scenario. The only thing outside of her expectation was the appearance of the damned witch. But she couldn't back off now. Retreating because she was afraid of a single witch was not something that could happen. The parasites also had hidden cards. 2. No. 3. Abhorrent charity. Release your divinity. Don't just stand there and do something. As the parasite queen's message echoed out, the nests throbbed simultaneously and poured out countless parasites. They had given up on infesting the fortress and were choosing to focus on giving birth. Abhorrent charity flinched. But seeing the nests, he quickly understood the queen's intent and scanned the battlefield. The sky fairies were debilitated from the resonance phenomenon. The best-case scenario would be to single out sky fairies and kill them, but that wasn't realistically possible due to the revival of the world tree. Not only were the sky fairies inside the fortress, but there was also a powerful witch protecting it. And so, abhorrent charity's gaze fell outside Tiggle Fortress at humanity's cavalry unit. Looking back, the appearance of these insects seemed to be the start of the complications. The important thing was to not let this trend continue. Even if they had to retreat, they had to at least do as much damage as possible. I'll wipe all of you out completely.
KKDK. Gritting his teeth, abhorrent Charity burst out with a brilliant light. His fluttering robe billowed out, and dozens of tentacles shot out from his sleeves along with a fierce evil energy. Then, the biggest tentacle pointed toward a giant mountain of corpses in front of the fortress wall.
Arise!
When that single word echoed out, the mountain of corpses shook.
The lifeless corpses began to crack open, and the skeletons inside them began to rise one by one.
Eventually, over half of the corpses gave birth to moving undead that staggered up to their feet and awaited their master's command.
Tisk.
Despite such an incredible display of necromancy, abhorrent Charity clicked his tongue.
Normally, the mountain of corpses should have all risen from the dead.
But because of the damned world tree, a portion of the land had turned into a holy area, which cut down his evil energy greatly.
If he didn't release his divinity, even the current result would not have been possible.
But that didn't matter. There were more mountains of corpses to go through, and this was more than enough to wipe out a bunch of insects.
Arise! Another group of skeletons tore through a mountain of corpses. Go!
As abhorrent Charity gave the command, the undying army of skeletons that were strengthened by his evil energy marched forward. They're coming. Having regrouped in the meanwhile, Teresa wet her dry lips with her saliva.
Countless parasites were flooding from the front and the army of skeletons was rushing in from the back.
The only solace in this situation was that the parasites weren't attacking the sky fairies that were inside Tiggle Fortress, but that was hardly anything to celebrate, seeing as how humanity was about to be wiped out. But looking at this turn of events from a different perspective, it meant that this was the only option the parasites had.
With the world tree present, capturing Tiggle Fortress within a short period of time was impossible. So they must be planning to do as much damage as possible, before deciding to choose between the safer option of retreating or the riskier option of entering a prolonged war. General Sanctus.
Stealing her resolve, Teresa called Jan Sanctus. As they didn't have much time, she quickly gave her command.
I'll leave the rear side to you. I will handle the parasites with the equites. You only have to buy time. Got that? Understood. Please be careful, princess. Of course. My hubby's finally come back.
If I die without talking to him again, I'll become a ghost from resentment.
Teresa pushed her helm down while murmuring jokingly.
Jan Sanctus chuckled. Next, with the cavalry heading forward and the infantry heading backward, the two troops left to fight the enemies storming in. Just like that, the battle that had fallen into a momentary lull continued.
All men.
Assume the shield formation. The infantry instantly stopped marching at Jan Sanctus' command. Ramming their shields to the ground and stacking another layer of shields on top, they formed a double-layered defensive formation.
On the other hand, it doesn't look like the parasite queen is planning on giving up. Gabriel, who was watching this turn of events, spread her wings and glanced to the side.
What are you going to do?
Next to her was a beastman whose mane was flowing down with dried-up blood. Standing on the wall, he was looking down at the battlefield with a complicated expression. We are going to back up the cavalry.
But we don't have enough reserve forces to aid the infantry as well.
So, Beastman King, tell me your answer.
A deep conflict surfaced on the Beastman's face. But with the situation being what it was, his hesitation did not last long.
Damn it. If they had acted like this several years ago,
I would have been out there with them long ago.
After finally spitting out a few sentences, Ku-hu-hum,
he opened his mouth and let out a roar.
Gabriel grinned before grabbing the Beastman King and flapping her wings.
As she flew up and led the way, fallen angels carrying a beastman in their hands flew up from every corner of the fortress.
Meanwhile, the distance between the infantry assuming a wall of shields and the skeleton army marching forward with earth-shaking tremors closed to about 100 meters.
Hold your ground. Bet your lives on it.
10 minutes. No, 5 minutes is enough.
If you can hold out for that much, victory will be ours." Jan Songtus shouted passionately and encouraged the soldiers. Standing in the front line with his shield, he kept his eyes fixed in front of him.
Kung, 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 kung. 50 meters.
The distance shortened rapidly even as he spoke.
40 meters, 30 meters, 20 meters, 10 meters. Everyone.
Eventually, as Jan Songtus was about to shout again,
"Kung, kung, kung, kung,"
he was stopped short.
It was because he felt the presence of something raining down behind him. No way! All sorts of thoughts crossed his mind.
Did the enemy break through the cavalry?
Did the parasite's flying creatures come down?
Did a new army appear from the back?
Or,
subconsciously looking back, Jan Songtus became dazed in an instant.
all his guesses were proven to be false.
The troops that landed behind them weren't the parasites, the flying creatures, nor the army of an army commander.
The foot soldiers lightly pressing down on his comrades' shoulders and jumping up were none other than that of the Beastman race. Looking up in a daze, Jan Songtus saw the Beastman king glancing down at him.
Their eyes met for a split second. Then, the Beastmen leapt past the line of defense, flashing their eyes as they glared at the skeleton army.
Ku-hu-hum. Starting with the Beastman king, the Beastmen growled ferociously and clashed with the skeleton army.
Jan Songtus blinked dazedly.
He shut his eyes, then opened them once again. He wasn't seeing things. The Beastmen were scuffling with the skeleton army.
The Beastmen race that detested humanity as much as the parasites after the fall of the Beastmen alliance was fighting for their sake. Jan Songtus' lips trembled with emotions.
A hot fire spread out inside his heart. Would he have ever expected this scene during the days when slave hunting was rampant in Eva?
General! Jan Songtus snapped out of his daze at a soldier's shout.
All men! Finally grabbing a hold of the voice stuck in his throat. Charge! He shouted at the top of his lungs.
In the next moment, the infantry simultaneously shot up and charged forward as if they had been waiting for these words. Joining hands with the Beastmen, they pushed forward, breaking the indiscriminately marching skeleton army with their spears and shields. At last, after regrettably brushing past each other's fingertips for so long, the Federation and humanity firmly grasped each other's hands.
Kook! The parasite queen groaned. She did not expect the Beastmen and fallen angels to come out of the fortress. What are vulgar chastity and exploding patience doing? She went, ah, after blurting out.
Vulgar chastity's succubi were blown back by the witch. There was no need to even mention exploding patience's banshees as they had sacrificed them to the thunders to let vulgar chastity break through. The one who gave this command was none other than the parasite queen herself. Things would not have turned out this badly if she had followed the army commander's plan and carried out the attack by the book. Don't tell me. The parasite queen fell down on the broken throne. At the time, she thought it was the only option. That was a wrong move as well.
And here, yet another thing outside of the parasite queen's expectation occurred. Her eyebrows twitched as she blankly stared at the moving image in front of her. Just like a belated realization. The blessing of the world tree wasn't affecting only the sky fairies, but also the cave fairies. What? In this stifling silence, the parasite queen's eyes widened abruptly. It was because she could feel the trembling energy rising from the fortress. Two energies that could not be felt before were not only casting over Tiggle Fortress but also flooding out to the rest of the battlefield. In that instant, the heads of the fairies sitting on their knees from exhaustion shot up. Wish! An untimely, fierce gale swept through the battlefield. Crackle! Distinctive fire blazed up here and there. The current of the air changed, the earth rumbled, and water sprouted up, sparkling under the sunlight. Inside the banquet of 5 elements, the fairies slowly stood up. Both sky fairies and cave fairies stared straight ahead. Although tears were streaming down their faces, they no longer seemed to be in sorrow.
If anything, they seemed to be enraged. They glared at the enemy with killing intent, as if to burst out with resentment and hatred that they had suppressed within themselves. That wasn't all.
2 pairs of pupils appeared from the sky and the ground. From the sky, eyes of light scattering a brilliant light. From the ground, eyes of darkness scattering reddish-black darkness. One looked down and one looked up at the battlefield. Woo! The howl of Afinu Odor, the Lord of Light revered by all spirits. Woo!
And the howl of Diffidum Odor, the Lord of Darkness feared by all spirits, echoed out one after the other as if to descend from the sky and rise up from the ground. The spirits had kept their promise. The spirit lords that started a war with the 7 virtues in the unrecorded mythical era, thousands of years ago, reappeared in Tiggle Fortress. The allied force of the Federation and humanity had come together fully to combat the parasites.
Opening square bracket ellipsis closing square bracket.
At the same time, witnessing the appearance of the light and the darkness, the parasite queen's lips were trembling more strongly than ever before. The revival of the world tree and the appearance of a powerful witch was already threatening to overthrow the tide of battle. But now, even the 2 sealed spirit lords popped out. The gears of fate that were once in perfect harmony had twisted out of place once or twice, and now they were crumbling down in total chaos.
Ah! Ah! The parasite queen clutched her head. And around this time, phew! The expedition team was fully summoned to the middle world. Sol Jihu let out a deep breath, opened his eyes silently, and looked straight ahead. He gazed at the parasite queen within the distant image in the sky. You! Their eyes met.
You, all because of you, all because of yo! The enraged voice of the parasite queen erupted out.
Sol Jihu's eyes turned sharp.
He took a deep breath and fixed his grip on the spear of purity.
Finally.
They had finally come this far.
Taking another breath, Sol Jihu raised his spear and took a step forward.
Staring at the spirits spread out on the battlefield and pointing his spear at the parasite queen, he said firmly, "Everyone, get ready for battle.
And thus,
don't let a single one of them escape."
The flare signaling the start of a counterattack shot up. Chapter 342. The great counterattack began.
The allied forces of the Federation and humanity, which had been losing since the start of the siege, had finally found a way to turn the tide against their enemy.
The first sign of change appeared at Tiggle Fortress. Kiyu!
Abhorrent Charity groaned, waving his tentacles.
The situation suddenly became so chaotic that he could not tell what was happening.
However, the cause of the change was clear.
The world tree, fully grown and at its prime, to make matters worse, had appeared out of nowhere.
As the avatar of the world tree took root, the land surrounding the tree became sacred, blessed, and protected by the divine tree. For that reason, even after the unsealing of his divinity, Abhorrent Charity's power was greatly limited.
Moreover, the duration of his divinity, which had been short from the beginning, was further reduced. Damn it!
Abhorrent Charity, who rarely showed his feelings, flew into a rage. The revival of the world tree had certainly boosted the strength of the enemy. He now had no choice but to produce more soldiers, even at the risk of a further decrease in the duration of his divinity, just to match the strength of their opponents.
Arise!
The energy emanating from his billowing robe became stronger. Abhorrent Charity extended his tentacles toward a mountain of corpses piled up on the cliff.
But the Federation didn't sit back and watch.
"Everyone, to your respective positions!" A sky fairy elder cried out. The vengeful sky fairies immediately began to move as if they had been waiting for this moment. Most of them flew over the fortress wall, but some slipped into a path near the middle of the staircase and quickly hid inside the engine devices prepared by the dwarfs.
"Open!" a small, shaggy dwarf shouted.
Then, the most surprising thing happened.
Rumble, rumble, rattle. A door opened on the impregnable Tiggle fortress. What opened wasn't the fortress gate but a vertical gap stretching from the bottom of the cliff to the base of the fortress. The gap was only slightly spread out like a half-open door. Veni, Domini Spiritum Terra.
Sky fairies inside the fortress stretched their arms toward the gap.
Instantly, bumpy, reddish, human-like figures rose like moles from the ground and rocks. The earth spirits pushed the fortress wall, and the small gap widened instantaneously. The huge gate surrounding the cliff swung open, knocking over the bodies piled up on the edge of the cliff. La ultim volet, quasi spinum. Another group of earth spirits rose from inside the gap as sky fairies chanted their spells again. The newly formed spirits soon turned into sharp, cone-shaped rocks, each about 2 to 30 centimeters long. It was as if a ferocious beast had opened its mouth wide, to expose its sharp teeth. All sky fairies backed away.
Meanwhile, the earth spirits who had pushed the wall earlier exited the fortress and began pushing the gate in the opposite direction.
Boom! The entire cliff shook. The gate closed at once as it did when it opened.
And while closing, it dragged into it the corpses struggling to move after receiving energy.
All the bodies scattered near the fortress disappeared in an instant. From inside the cliff came a mushy, unpleasant sound. It was the sound of bodies being needled by thorns and crashing against the wall.
Abhorrent Charity's tentacles trembled.
He needed those corpses in order to produce more blood golems and the undying army. Corpses trampled to the point where there was not a drop of blood left inside were simply useless. With the revival of the World Tree and the restoration of the Sky Fairies' spirit power, Tiggle Fortress regained its prior status as the impregnable fortress. The fortress. Exploding Patience's jaw dropped. Hundreds of thousands of vines poured out from the fortress walls like waterfalls and began mercilessly chopping the skeletons driven into a corner by the beastmen and infantry. "You vermins!" Exploding Patience yelled condescendingly but looked nervous. She was recalling the past when the 5 army commanders unsealed their divinities at once but still failed to break down the iron wall. Still, she couldn't just stand there and watch. Exploding Patience drew a deep breath and prepared to launch a high-frequency attack. She first planned to dampen the opponent's enthusiasm through a curse called Wailing of the Banshee Queen, which could affect many enemies at once. She paused, however, when she saw dozens of iron cannons lined up on the fortress walls. "Take aim." Sweating profusely, the dwarfs carried the cannons to the top. Arriving at their destination, they rushed thunders into the artillery. Sky fairies chanted, "Per aerium, comprimentru." The air in the nozzle was quickly compressed. The dwarfs picked up the cannons and aimed them straight at the targets in the air. Shoot! Boom! Pushed by the pressure, blue stones burst out of the cannons. These stones were already twice as powerful as arrows, but this wasn't the end. Yu-jin excellatio. Suddenly the wind blew hard. The wind pushed the already speeding thunders forward. At this point, they could no longer be likened to arrows or even cannonballs. After numerous accelerations, the blue stones reached their targets faster than the blink of an eye. It was then that the air spirits guarding the bombs disappeared, and thunders began to radiate blue light after coming in contact with the air. Exploding Patience's eyes became as big as a cannon nozzle. Flash! Azure light covered the sky. Kook! Unsightly humility deflected the giant sword and the chained arrow of the executors and clenched his teeth looking up at the sky. He tried to summon his undead army, but it wasn't easy. The parasites that the nests were spitting out tried to clear the way, but humanity's cavalry and the fallen angels stood in their way. Moreover, cave fairies and spirit kings were also attacking them from the side. The combined might of the enemy forces was impossible to penetrate. The parasites were undoubtedly at a disadvantage. However, unsightly humility soon realized that this was not the time to worry about others. What? Hying! His spectral horse faltered and neighed. A thunderous roar rang from above and below, and the ground was shaking as it split.
A hand made of light came down from the sky and grabbed unsightly Humility's neck. From the ground, a crimson hand came up and grabbed his legs. The hands began to pull unsightly Humility in both directions as if competing against each other over the ownership of the army commander.
Coo!
Greatly astonished, unsightly Humility tried to fend them off but failed. The energy of light and darkness easily surpassed the power of the 5 spirit kings.
It was not something he could avoid. He felt his joints break and his bones crack.
He screamed in pain. Seeing that unsightly Humility couldn't move, the executors gladly rushed at him. Laughing hysterically, Tatiana Chinzia ordered the Valkyries to charge, and unsightly Humility shattered his teeth from grinding them too hard. It hadn't been long since he recovered from the side effects of unsealing his divinity during the Arden Valley War, but at this point, he had no choice.
Damn.
At last, the light exploded and unsightly Humility swelled up. A dark knight dressed in black iron armor from head to toe roared furiously.
Unsightly Humility had unsealed his divinity at last.
Even you. Vulgar Chastity looked behind her shoulder in disbelief. She couldn't believe that not only abhorrent Charity but also exploding Patience and unsightly Humility had unsealed their divinity. Given the side effects that they had to endure, relying on their divinity was the last resort, and rightly so.
This is how bad the situation is.
Vulgar Chastity quickly shot up to the sky. Now that the World Tree had been revived, staying inside Tiggle Fortress would be no different than committing suicide. She had planned to retreat and assess the situation from afar, but an ice wall suddenly shot up in front of her. The soaring wall bent its ends inward, drawing a curve. Vulgar Chastity stopped as she noticed that the wall was coming at her like a tsunami.
Yuri, no. Russell was singing, waving her hands delicately. Her facial expression seemed to say, "Where do you think you're going?" Vulgar Chastity clenched her teeth.
You really want to try me?
She hissed, and at once, white light enveloped her body.
The unsealing of Vulgar Chastity's divinity wasn't as flashy as that of Raging Temperance.
It was calm like that of Twisted Kindness, but she didn't suddenly get larger.
Instead, a shiny, transparent cloth enveloped her body, white feathers covered her bat wings, and her violet hair turned white and grew until it almost touched the ground. It's like a magical girl transformation?
Yuri, what does that mean? Russell asked curiously while shifting her gaze to her enemy.
With her shiny, silver hair, flowy cloth, and fluttering, white wings, Vulgar Chastity resembled an elegant goddess. The change intensified the overall feeling of incongruity coming from her. Her outward appearance contrasted sharply with her slanted crimson eyes brimming with vulgarity. What was it again? Freeze, world? The corner of Vulgar Chastity's mouth curled upward.
Bullshit. She snorted and fluttered her long eyelashes. Fine.
Then I'll say this.
Burn, world.
Vulgar Chastity widened her eyes and stretched her arms to the front.
Whoosh. All the cloth floating around her turned into flames that rushed towards her enemy. At the same time, Russell completed her spell and spread her hands. Freeze, world. The spell summoned a huge blizzard. Flames shot out like laser beams and covered the frost storm. Cheek! An immense amount of steam formed where the two energies collided with each other.
The inside of the fortress became clouded with steam. The two energies pushed and pulled against each other for a while until finally a strand of flame managed to penetrate the storm. The flame quickly crossed the sky, leaving a long afterimage, and Russell hurriedly raised the altitude of her broomstick.
Aha! Vulgar Chastity tilted her head back. It was just as she had expected.
Russell might be a big shot in another dimension, but she was still no match for an army commander with unsealed divinity like herself.
Ow, ow, ow. Russell smiled as she shook her aching hands. I see, you had a trick up your sleeve.
That's right.
You should have just stayed put in your dimension. I like your confidence.
But judging by the constant fluctuations in your energy, you must not be able to control it well.
Are you sure you can last long enough to defeat me? Ha! Don't you worry about it. Vulgar Chastity hissed.
The world tree might be close, but it can't stop me from defeating you and getting away. As she said so, her silver-white hair spread out like the tail of a peacock. The strands of her hair spouted out with whip-like elasticity toward Roussel.
They moved like snakes with venom dripping from its mouth. A witch, no matter how great she might be, was no different from an ordinary person if she didn't have time to chant spells. At best, she would fly around on her broomstick, dodging the attacks.
If she made even a single mistake, she would get pierced to death by a strand of Vulgar Chastity's hair. A recital, huh?
Enough with the singing. Instead, why don't you dance like a whore for me?
And say goodbye while you're at it.
Convinced of her own victory, Vulgar Chastity smirked.
But soon, she furrowed her brows.
You're the whore, you motherfucking bitch. Contrary to Vulgar Chastity's expectations, Roussel snorted in place rather than running away.
A prostitute who's been rolling around in a brothel dares to say that to me?
Aw,
aren't you forgetting something? A scornful voice rang out.
Roussel smirked and shrugged her shoulders. You and I are not the only ones here. If you're talking about the world tree.
Vulgar Chastity stopped midway through her sentence.
Suddenly, a giant bird pierced through the thick fog and landed in front of Roussel. The bright red flames surrounding the bird burned like phoenixes, obstinately offsetting Vulgar Chastity's attack.
A phoenix?
No, it's the Arcus spirit. Shocked, Vulgar Chastity hurriedly looked ahead. Golden sparks crackled up. She could see about 3 or 4 faint shadows in the fog. Before she knew it, a young man in a torn coat and a woman in a white traditional robe rushed out of the thick fog. Ah! Vulgar Chastity's breathing stopped. She recognized both of them.
How could she forget?
One was the Sacred Empress, and, you. The other was the demonic spearman, who humiliated her during the Valley War. But they weren't the only problems. Light poured down like a meteor from the sky, and dozens of magic circles twirled above, emitting light. The Star of Lust and the Star of Greed. 2 executors had arrived. Q Queen. Vulgar Chastity's gaze wandered up and down as she muttered in despair. Like a child who lost her mother, she kept calling the Queen's name. The Parasite Queen looked down at the battlefield.
After a series of scuffles, the war had become a complete mess. The situation was, of course, unfavorable for the parasites. That much, she could tell from the colors that filled the battlefield.
Not long ago, the battlefield was full of gray. But since the World Tree appeared, colorful lights were beginning to fill the view. The color of the Federation and humanity was growing as they pushed the gray color away. The Parasite Queen's eyes twitched slightly when she realized the parasites were losing. She was okay with struggling a little, but to be actually losing, she wasn't used to that sort of thing. But then she thought of the past. Capturing Tiggle Fortress was something the parasites barely managed to succeed in doing after weakening the World Tree, sacrificing the 5 army commanders with unsealed divinities and concentrating hundreds of nests on the fortress. The Federation was now stronger than ever, and Tiggle Fortress was even sturdier than it was in the past. On top of that, humanity had come to help. So perhaps it wasn't too surprising that the 4 army commanders were losing even after unsealing their divinities. The biggest problem was the World Tree. The Divine Tree at its full power continuously stimulated the fundamental conflict in the makeup of the army commanders: the divine energy, which came from the divinity of the 7 virtues, and the dark energy, which was the fundamental attribute of the army commanders. The tree was slowly destabilizing the divinities of the army commanders, trying to disrupt their assembled bodies internally. This was the reason that the army commanders' divinities were weakened in a sealed state and their duration shortened in an unsealed state. As if that wasn't enough, the Queen had just received another piece of unfortunate news. It seemed the Earthlings were finally on the move. They were quickly descending the mountain and attacking the nests that were busy giving birth to the mother species.
As shameless as they were, these attacks were effective.
In a situation when all the army commanders were in danger, the future of the parasites would be bleak if they lost their nests as well.
It's all my fault. There's a saying that history was result-oriented.
Dwelling on the past was meaningless now. She never imagined her decision to send the army commanders to the battlefield would bring about such repercussions. Although they were somehow holding out, time wasn't on the side of the parasites. What would happen after the army commanders ran out of time?
Having imagined the worst, the parasite queen closed her eyes and lamented. If only she had summoned raging temperance or sent only twisted kindness. If only she had the 7th Army commander that could do twice the work of the other commanders. If only she hadn't given those orders earlier. Many thoughts raced through her mind, but the parasite queen quickly shook her head.
It was simply impossible to pinpoint where exactly it went wrong. The time had come for her to make a decision. It was time for her to play her trump card. Opening square bracket ellipsis closing square bracket.
But calling it a trump card was putting it nicely. A trump card was simply a secret that was kept hidden and unused.
It would have the biggest impact when used at a decisive moment. Using it because she had no other choice only made her bitter. No, it was more than just bitter, it was painful. But right now, she really had no other choice. It would be better to use it than to risk losing everything.
Determined, the parasite queen shifted her gaze. There, a young man sat on a hill, looking down at the battlefield nonchalantly with a piece of grass in his mouth.
He was once a hero who made a series of great contributions to humanity.
But now, he was a traitor to mankind. And though still lacking in control, he was the only one besides twisted kindness to fully absorb his divinity and the only constellation comparable to the resurrected star. The parasite queen opened her mouth quietly. Sung Shi-hyun.
Chapter 343.
Sung Shi-hyun was observing the battlefield with nonchalant eyes. He seemed a little angry.
No, not angry. Rather, the lines between his eyebrows indicated frustration. Finally, he closed his eyes and shook his head as if he couldn't stand to watch any longer.
He couldn't be blamed. Spectators in the stands hoped for the game they were watching to be so intense that they would have to sit on the edge of their seats the entire time.
But the players on the field had different opinions. They would rather win by a mile than stay on their toes all through the game. Of course, if they were on the losing side. Fucking shit. They would curse like so.
That was exactly how Sung Shi-hyun felt right now, especially as a human who defected to the parasite's side.
It was like playing a game of chance.
He had been betting on odd, when the result had been even, for hundreds of times in a row, and now that he'd finally bet everything he had left on even, he got stuck with an odd.
Seriously, I don't understand. Why did the world tree suddenly revive? What's with that light and darkness? What moron let things get this messed up?
Sung Shi-hyun.
The moron, or rather, the one in charge of this situation called him. You will need to help out.
Sung Shi-hyun bit his tongue and glanced up at the sky.
Should we keep going? Or we will retreat. A wise judgment. Sung Shi-hyun gave a deep sigh and nodded.
Well, how exactly can I help? Vulgar chastity is in danger.
Can you buy her some time? Confused, Sung Shi-hyun tilted his head.
He had expected orders to rescue the army commanders or create an escape route for them, and so was preparing to tell the queen that he couldn't do both.
But to stall for time, that wasn't something he expected to hear.
The parasite queen seemed to have made an important decision. At this point, I guess it would be hard to come out unscathed without trying something risky.
Sung Shi-hyun muttered to himself and nodded. Of course, but I can't stall for long.
You know about my current condition, right?
I do. I apologize for pushing you too hard. Please, don't apologize.
You did nothing wrong.
It's their fault for not living up to your expectations. Sung Shi-hyun said sarcastically before getting up and dusting off his clothes. He grabbed the sword at his waist and asked abruptly,
"Your Majesty, would you allow me to kill 1 or 2 people on the way?"
"It'll help Blackie too."
"Blackie?"
"I mean unsightly humility. I think I can deal the enemy a blow before we retreat." "Will it affect your ability to carry out my orders?" "Of course not.
Right now, no one knows I've turned to the parasites.
And they're all too busy fighting."
The parasite queen gave a renewed look. Now that she decided to play her trump card, it wouldn't be a bad idea to make the most of it. Their chances were good, especially for the first blow.
"All right, go ahead. I will be looking forward to it." "Please do." Looking at the battlefield, Sung Shi-hyun said with a sly smile,
"I'll come back with good news that can appease your anger."
Pop! With the sound of the air exploding, Sung Shi-hyun vanished without a trace. He was next seen running down the hill, then he disappeared again and reappeared at the bottom of the hill.
Though he did not seem to have made any effort to run, such as bending his knees or even taking his feet off the ground, he had already arrived at the battlefield. This was the effect of the skill representative of a level 7 unique Rancor warrior, Ethereal Shift.
Sung Shi-hyun had just used it several times in a row.
The Star of Pride, the executor of Superbia, was full of excitement for the first time in a long time.
He wasn't excited by the war itself per se, but he took pleasure in turning the game around.
The Death Knights had already been exterminated, and unsightly humility was barely holding out even after unsealing his divinity.
Kook! Unsightly humility quickly pulled the reins and the spectral horse lifted its legs. A huge hand made of light smashed the place where the horse's legs had just been. Before unsightly humility could even relax, however, the spectral horse suddenly stopped. The earth was boiling and white steam filled the view. A crimson hand had clasped the horse's legs. The heat was beginning to melt the horse's hooves.
Astonished, unsightly humility planted his sword down on the ground.
The crimson hand quickly released the horse's legs, but when he turned his eyes, the hand of light slapped his entire body.
The horse cried pitifully as unsightly humility flew off and fell to the ground.
Shivering, the commander quickly opened his eyes. His horse was surrounded by Valkyries. The moment he saw dozens of lances piercing his horse, he knew what had just happened. Kuwa!
Enraged, unsightly humility rushed at the enemy.
He first slashed the Valkyries, then immediately raised his sword and slammed it down on the ground. Crack! The ground cracked and shattered all around him. Shock waves from the sword flew past the spot where Chinzia had just stood and exploded when it reached the cliff. He truly had a Herculean strength. However, even before he could catch his breath, unsightly humility had to raise his shield. Dealing with the spirit lords of light and darkness and the Star of Sloth was difficult enough, but they weren't the only ones surrounding him. Tang, 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 tang. Chained arrows flew at unsightly humility's shield in unison, blocking his movement. The Star of Wrath did not pass up this opportunity and rushed in from the side with the greatsword. Unsightly humility parried the attack with a skillful movement of his longsword and strongly struck the greatsword down. However, the Star of Wrath let go of his sword and rolled himself up. With unbelievable agility unbefitting of his large stature, he quickly shot towards the enemy, tackling him. Doarya! Unsightly humility stumbled as the Star of Wrath rammed into him. At the same time, chained arrows flew at him like a net and coiled around his entire body. Rendered immobile in an instant, unsightly humility felt a chill run down his spine. Once again, energies that could not be ignored descended and soared from the sky and the ground. They came at him with clear intentions of crushing him flat. Suddenly, his hollow eyes flashed blue. Qua! Divinity release. The burst of energy disassembled all chains and covered the light and darkness. Even though he was out of danger, unsightly humility didn't look happy. He'd been repeating these same procedures for quite some time now. Of course, in some regards, holding his ground against 2 demigods and 3 executors under the restrictive influence of the World Tree was amazing.
But however amazing it may be, it didn't change the fact that he was at a disadvantage. The duration of his divinity was getting shorter every second, and releasing it on top of that put a lot of pressure on his body.
Unsightly humility knew he could do this only a few more times.
The Star of Pride, on the other hand, was having a blast. His face filled with excitement when he realized he was on the verge of capturing the army commander. Whether it be fame or contribution points, he would not be lacking if he was successful.
Even reaching level 8 would no longer be a dream.
Dreaming of a rosy future, the Star of Pride suddenly came back to reality. Knocking another arrow against his bow, he gazed at unsightly humility, who was standing motionlessly. Why isn't he moving?
He wondered. It was then that he realized the quickly approaching presence. An earthling wearing an iron helmet, cape flying, was running towards them at considerable speed.
"I'll help you." "What?" Before he could say anything, the man rushed in like the wind towards unsightly humility and attempted to attack him from the side.
Of course, unsightly humility wasn't just going to watch.
Keeping an eye out for the hands, the army commander swung his sword, and the man was immediately thrown to the ground.
Hey, you moron! The Star of Pride yelled at the man flying towards him while scattering his blood in the air.
Even if you're thirsty for contribution points, don't stick your nose where it doesn't bellow.
He paused all of a sudden. A vague feeling of suspicion overtook him. Perhaps the man's greed had numbed his fears, but to yell, "I'll help you," right before a surprise attack? That was definitely strange. Above all, the movement of the man's sword caught his eye. He couldn't quite tell whether it was intentional or not, but he noticed that the man's blade was coming towards his neck as he flew. He was in doubt for long but was quick to take action.
The Star of Pride unwittingly backed away from the man and fired an arrow. Just before the chain on the arrow wrapped around the man.
Damn! Pop!
An explosive sound rang out. The chains hit against each other instead of binding the man.
I see that your perception is just as fast as ever. Dazed, the Star of Pride looked back over his shoulders.
There, he saw a perfectly white row of teeth visible through a grin. You know what? Sensing danger, the archer's body moved automatically. At the same time, the thoughts, "He's not on our side," and "Can it be?" crossed his mind. However, the enemy's sword was much faster than him.
It was his mistake to allow the man to come near without suspecting that he might be an enemy. Of all the executors, I've always hated you the most. Swish!
That was the end. The Star of Pride's head separated from his body and flew into the air. The man landed in a heap amid everyone's astonishment.
Ho! Planting his feet firmly on the ground, he brandished his sword towards the sky.
It was a simple act, but massive shockwaves and crescent-shaped sword chi rushed forward.
The light and darkness quickly moved away in a startle. Man, they're perceptive too. The young man muttered as he threw off his helmet.
The face that was revealed grinned at unsightly humility.
Aren't you grateful? I am.
I heard your voice in my head and prepared in advance.
Yeah, nice shot. I got a light cut too.
That guy's quick-witted, so I wasn't sure if I could get near him within 6 steps. Sung Shi-hyun quickly stepped to the side. A loud bang rang out beside the archer's headless body.
Sung Shi-hyun.
The Star of Wrath was fuming with anger with his sword stuck in the ground.
You bastard! I was wondering why I haven't seen you in such a long time. But why?
Why do you think? Can't you see?
Sung Shi-hyun snorted and pointed at his body. The Star of Wrath became speechless.
There, a long wound was in the process of healing. Such regenerative ability meant only one thing. Sung Shi-hyun had accepted the Parasite Queen's authority into his body.
Whatever. I've got nothing to say to you.
Sung Shi-hyun said flatly and turned his gaze to Chinzia.
It's been a while, Fifth.
So Sixth isn't with you?
Where's my prim, bespectacled kitten?
Sung Shi-hyun asked playfully, looking around.
A look of bewilderment and confusion crossed Chinzia's face. She sighed and rubbed her temples.
You were gone for so long, so I suspected this might be the case, but you've really done it this time, you little horseshit.
Ha 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 ha. I warned you, remember?
Keep messing with me and I'll turn to the parasites. Did they promise you something good? Something worthy of giving up life on Earth?
Yep, they did. And life on Earth is overrated anyway. A bunch of jackasses are always trying to kidnap me every time I go back. Would you want to go back if you were in my shoes?
What?
Tilda, never mind.
None of that matters now.
I'm like, Sue Tilda per busy right now. I gotta go fulfill the Queen's orders.
Queen? You mean the parasite queen?
Yeah.
We're gonna retreat soon. So let's say goodbye here.
As if. The Star of Wrath shouted. As Sung Shi-hyun snickered, Chinzia's complexion waned. The Sung Shi-hyun she knew was a scumbag and a lecher, but his skills were real. He always did what he said he would do.
Just like this time, when he really turned to the parasites.
I told you, we're retreating. But it's really us doing you a favor. I admit you guys have an advantage, but do you think the parasites will go down that easily?
Really?
Sung Shi-hyun looked back at unsightly humility with a smirk. Hey, Blackie.
The Queen wants you to hang in there a little longer.
I removed one of them for you, so can you do it? Of course. You've been a great help. Unsightly humility answered, and at the same time, Death Knights began to rise from the ground. The spectral horse had been summoned again as well.
Then I'm leaving.
There's an even more dangerous place for me to go to. I assume you're talking about vulgar chastity. Go on. I'll take care of these guys. Of course, you will.
Sung Shi-hyun jumped up without hesitation.
He began to climb as if there were stairs in the air before looking back at Chinzia and waving his hand. Goodbye, Fifth. I'll see you in bed next time. With Sixth, of course. Unable to contain his anger, the burly man threw his greatsword.
But Sung Shi-hyun had already disappeared without a trace, and the sword pierced nothing but the empty air. Chinzia bit her lips, wary of unsightly humility who regained his composure. Sung Shi-hyun had already climbed the cliff and was crossing the fortress wall.
Meanwhile. Flames and screams were violently swirling inside the fortress. Flaming clothes and hair swirled around vulgar chastity, who had unsealed her divinity.
The barrier was dense enough not to fit a single drop of water, but that was all there was.
The expedition team had no reason to enter the burning barrier. Things were quite different from when they fought the army commanders in the spirit realm.
This time, the parasites were backed into a corner, and the Federation and humanity had the upper hand. The longer they held out, the more advantageous their situation would become. Moments later, the raging flames died down. Vulgar Chastity knew she was at a disadvantage and was smart enough not to waste all her energy at once. She had formed the barrier to prevent joint attacks by her enemies: the Star of Lust, the Star of Avarice, Rissel, and the Arcus Spirit, but she could not keep it longer than necessary. But the fact that the flames were gone meant that she was approachable again.
Sol Jihu's eyes lit up. Immediately, he dashed towards Vulgar Chastity using Flash Thunder. And it wasn't just Sol Jihu.
Baek Haiju, Agnes, and Hoshino Urara also took part in the attack from different angles.
Kaya!
Vulgar Chastity flashed her eyes as she revealed her fangs. Her eyes met Hoshino Urara's as she jumped in from the front. Yua? With a dazed look, Hoshino Urara fell to the ground. But there were still 3 remaining, so Vulgar Chastity quickly prepared the next move.
Glistening smoke gushed out of her body.
From the surface, the smoke looked like white clouds, but it was actually poisonous gas that melted everything that it touched. However, Sol Jihu did not stop Flash Thunder.
He believed in his comrades. Lu Shu Lu Luxuria. Avar Ava Avaritia.
A semi-spherical membrane enveloped Sol Jihu, and a strong wind blew away the smoke. Sol Jihu took this opportunity to thrust his spear, brimming with golden sword chi, into Vulgar Chastity.
Peetst. Vulgar Chastity's hair wrapped around the spear just in time to stop it.
It also swallowed Baek Haiju's spear and Agnes' threads.
Ooar.
Seeing the tip of the spear swaying right in front of her eyes, Vulgar Chastity moaned in panic.
She once again released her divinity. She expected the release to send her enemies flying. But somehow, the trio was still standing. She even felt they had become stronger. How? Vulgar Chastity could not hide her shock. Wish? It was only then that she realized that the space surrounding her was distorted.
Her energy was being cut off by a powerful force. When she saw Rissel with her forehead drenched in sweat and her hands stretched forward, she realized that the witch had somehow trapped her and her energy inside a barrier. Vulgar Chastity clenched her teeth and tried to break open the barrier. At that moment, the phoenix suddenly soared to the sky, spreading its wings and opening its beak wide. Vulgar Chastity trembled with fear when she saw a crimson ball of flame forming in his beak. She was just beginning to realize the reason that raging temperance and twisted kindness lost might not be just because of bad luck. It was then. Rissel, who was devoting all her energy to maintain the barrier, suddenly turned her head.
Sol Jihu also threw a glance in the same direction. A white line was drawn vertically in the middle of the huge ice barrier Rissel erected. Crack!
Before they knew it, the barrier shattered into pieces and a hole was formed in the middle. Sol Jihu flinched.
He might have been mistaken, but something seemed to have entered through that hole.
But he couldn't see anything unusual. As Sol Jihu tried to make sense of the situation, color drained from Baek Haiju's face.
She suddenly withdrew her spear and turned away. Wide-eyed, she threw the spear straight at the hole. However, boom! With a small explosion, her spear pierced through the empty air. What?
The phoenix must have seen the same thing Baek Haiju did, as it also spewed out flames toward the ice barrier. However, the flames, which were flying with tremendous momentum, were divided into pieces as if they had been cut by a sword.
Seeing this, Sol Jihu's doubt turned into certainty.
He immediately ran without hesitation.
He was planning to aim for the point where the flames split, but then, boom! He heard another explosion.
The flames merged into one again. It disappeared? Sol Jihu flinched with a frown on his face. Philip Muller, absent-mindedly blinking his eyes instead of chanting spells, came into his sight. Suddenly, for some unknown reason, an alarm bell rang inside Sol Jihu's head.
There was no time to hesitate. Although he still couldn't see anything with his eyes. Whoosh! Sol Jihu followed his intuition and darted towards Philip Muller.
As soon as he raised the spear of purity, a white sword appeared, cutting through the air.
Clang!
A metallic clanging rang out.
Sol Jihu held his breath at the unbelievable weight felt through his hands.
As he barely raised his head, he saw his spear blocking a white sword and the face of a young man holding the sword.
He could have sworn that this man wasn't here a second ago.
Everything felt surreal. But the young man seemed just as surprised as Sol Jihu. "You read Ethereal Shift? And you blocked my white fang?" Dazed, Sung Shihyun looked down.
Sol Jihu clenched his teeth and looked up.
The former's sharp, arrogant eyes met the latter's burning, dignified eyes.
"And so? You're…"
The two young men's gazes clashed violently in the air.
Chapter 344. It's been a while since I've met a guy who learned intuition. Sung Shi-hyun murmured in surprise. Even Haiju couldn't learn that skill.
Looks like yours is pretty high level too.
He also glanced at Philip Muller, whose eyes were split open in shock.
After showing a faint hint of regret, he vanished like smoke before appearing next to vulgar chastity a second later.
You! Come on, your knight in shining armor is here to save you.
You should be looking at me with dreamy eyes full of hearts.
Sung Shi-hyun sniggered.
Vulgar chastity's tense shoulders relaxed, and she let out a sigh of relief. Sung Shi-hyun. Although he had trouble controlling his divinity at the moment, at a time when the 7th Army commander had likely been defeated, he was the parasite's strongest card.
Thanks. Let's hurry. Nah, wait a bit, girl. I haven't seen them in a while.
Let me at least say, hi.
Sung Shi-hyun turned his gaze, snickering. Sol Ji-hoo carefully observed the man who appeared out of nowhere. From the looks of it, he seemed to be on the parasite's side. But he was clearly a human being.
Sol Ji-hoo looked around just to be sure, and lo and behold, some of the others looked greatly shocked. Agnes and Philip Muller couldn't close their dropped jaws. Baek Haiju and Seo Yuhui's faces were especially a sight to behold.
Yo!
Sung Shi-hyun said with a beaming smile. This is where everyone was?
It's been a while.
He cut himself short in the middle of his sentence and swung his longsword to the left like a flash of lightning.
Clang! The blade struck an ice spike that sprouted from the air and aimed for his head.
As he tightened his grip on his sword, cracks appeared on the ice before it shattered into thousands of pieces. Who did that?
I bet you're one of those people who attack someone when they're transforming. Sung Shi-hyun then glanced at Eun Yuri, who was floating in the air like him. His scowling eyes widened to a circle.
Being scanned from the face all the way down to the feet with such an obvious glance, both Russell and Eun Yuri felt chills run down their backs. They had a peculiar feeling similar to a worm crawling on their skin.
Tilda.
Sung Shi-hyun couldn't hide his shock.
So many that are my type. Alright, I've decided.
I'll let you be fourth. Fourth? You must have heard of the saying, a hero likes many women.
For someone like me, having several concubines is a given.
So you're saying?
Russell's long, slender eyebrows furrowed to a scowl. She looked as though she had been greatly insulted.
I've been chosen to be your fourth concubine?
Oh!
So you're not just a pretty face.
That's right. You can think of it as me calling dibs.
I like intelligent women.
Russell looked dumbfounded, but Sung Shi-hyun blabbered on, not caring in the slightest. You're more than qualified to compete for the wife position. That's why you're fourth. For the record, third is Haremark's princess.
The two of you can have fun working this out.
Russell stared at the babbling young man and asked.
I can curse you out, right?
Of course, go ahead. You're more than welcome to.
That makes me all the more passionate. Sung Shi-hyun chattered on.
Even though you look totally normal. Sigh. This is our first meeting, but I can tell what kind of person you are. No, were.
Russell sighed quietly while looking at the young man speechlessly.
She crossed her arms and gave him a pitying look.
A talented, competent man, who lacks character and feeds off of his own pride.
I've seen many people like this, and their endings are often the same.
They wander around unable to find a place for themselves, until being used as a rag and then ultimately being thrown away.
Ah, what a pitiful, moronic life, Tilda. No, you're wrong. Sung Shi-hyun snickered.
Am I?
Yep.
Because I wasn't thrown away.
I left on my own.
Sung Shi-hyun looked down. His gaze remained on Chung Cho-hong and Phi Sora for a moment, and then he turned to Seo Yuhui, Baek Haiju, and Agnes and smiled at them one by one. Isn't that right?
First, second, and
I haven't seen you in a while, sixth. Sung Shi-hyun waved his hand. An irredeemable man.
Agnes gritted her teeth.
The other two did not respond. Seo Yuhui looked stunned as if she received a great shock while Baek Haiju's face flashed back and forth between red and purple, as though she was trying hard to rein in her anger. Sung Shi-hyun rejoiced as he saw them. "You guys miss me?"
"I bet you did."
"But what a shame, I've already turned to the parasites." His beaming smile really provoked one's urge to punch him.
"See, you should have treated me better when you had the chance."
"What, you really thought I wouldn't turn to the parasites?" "Really?" Sol Ji-hoo was taken aback as he saw the snickering young man. He seemed to be Sung Shi-hyun, one of the legendary Earthlings. Although Sol Ji-hoo had heard of his name several times before, he was giving off a different vibe than what Sol Ji-hoo anticipated. To put it into words, Sol Ji-hoo felt like he was looking at a manchild who was begging for attention. "So, how does it feel?" Sung Shi-hyun asked with a flushed voice.
The answer he was expecting seemed to be along the lines of, "Why are you doing this?" or, "We're sorry. Please snap out of it and come back to us."
Baek Haiju's throat drew a huge gulp.
She took a deep breath, and her flushed complexion subsided quickly.
Then, she glared at Sung Shi-hyun with her uniquely cold eyes.
"Whatever."
"Whatever. That's right. Whether you defect to the parasites or not, what the hell does it have to do with me?"
"Ooh, Tilda, what a strong move."
"But I can tell you're mad from your voice." "That's just what you're hoping for."
"But we're talking about a guy who has nothing going for him other than his strength."
"I never expected anything from you, so I've got nothing to be disappointed or mad about." This is perfect.
"I've wanted to kill you on more than a couple of occasions.
Thank you for going to the parasites.
Now I can kill you proudly."
Sung Shi-hyun smacked his lips, perhaps because he got an answer he wasn't expecting.
"Your temper hasn't gone anywhere, huh? Well, that's what makes you charming," he murmured quietly before glancing at Seo Yuhui, who he designated as first. "Do you think the same way, you?"
He made a bitter expression without finishing his question as Seo Yuhui was glaring at him with eyes filled with disgust and sympathy.
She was clearly repulsed. She even covered her mouth with her hand and retched. "Disgusting." She wiped her mouth and finally spat out a word.
Sol Ji-hoo was speechless. This was the first time the kind Seo Yuhui was showing such disgust and revulsion. "That's harsh."
"I can't do anything about it if that's how you really feel."
It must have been a shock to Sung Shi-hyun as well since he scratched his head hard.
"Well, too bad." He shrugged as the corner of his mouth curled up. "No matter how much you all hate it, in the end, you'll end up pregnant from this irredeemable, disgusting trash of a man. So be good and get along now, alright?" Killing intent soared up from Baek Haiju's body. However, Sung Shi-hyun trembled as if just thinking about this pretend future made him elated. "Ah! The same goes for the pretty red hair over there too." The pretty red hair, whom Sung Shi-hyun pointed at just now, raised her eyebrow.
"You're saying I'm seventh?"
"Bingo. I was debating between you and the chick with the mace, but you're better in my eyes." "Ah, Tilda, is that so?"
"At least you know who's pretty."
"Unfortunately for you, I have high standards. And you're lacking in qualification by a long shot."
"Don't worry. A snobbish, ladylike maiden like you is exactly my type."
"You hee 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 hee."
Sung Shi-hyun simpered. Phi Sora frowned and turned away after spitting on the ground.
"Wow. I've heard the rumors, but this is the first time rumors were under-exaggerating."
This summarized the thoughts of everyone observing Sung Shi-hyun. Baek Haiju was feigning being calm at a glance, but her throat was trembling noticeably.
However, she held herself back one more time. She knew too well why Sung Shi-hyun was saying all this. Provoking the enemy was both his strong point and specialty. Being on the receiving end of it for once was aggravating, but reacting to it was the same as falling for his scheme. "Hold on. Let me lower myself to the same level as that son of a bitch." Sol Ji-hoo, who was looking for an opening to sneak attack, blinked in confusion.
Baek Haiju's voice had suddenly rung inside his head. Mental transmission, was it?
I don't give a shit about how you feel, but unfortunately for you.
Baek Haiju got closer to Sol Jihoo before he could even finish his thought. Then, his eyes started blinking even more quickly.
It was because Baek Haiju clung to him closely and locked her arm with his. I already have a man.
Sung Shi-hyun's laughter vanished, though he still maintained his smile. Oh. When did my second learn how to flirt? What, you want me to get jealous?
No, I'm just telling you the truth. Ha, don't go too far.
How is he any better than me?
If you want to fool me, you should at least bring a guy who's in the same league as me. Sung Shi-hyun mocked, but Baek Haiju didn't bat an eye. Rather, the smile on her face only grew thicker. I guess you're right. He's in a completely different league than you. I feel sorry even comparing the two of you. Ha! You know, my boyfriend entered paradise far later than you. But he's far more famous than you.
Sung Shi-hyun's smile faded away.
He remembered how the parasite queen constantly mentioned a certain earthling after he switched sides. He's more capable than you. His personality is decent. He's handsome. And his skill in bed is just.
Aw. I guess I don't know about the last one since I've never done it with you. Though, I doubt you're anything special compared to him. Was she normally like this?
Sol Jihoo was a little surprised seeing the coldly sneering Baek Haiju. She was better at provoking people than he originally thought. Even the constantly smiling Sung Shi-hyun was staring with his eyes narrowed.
Oh yeah, do you want me to tell you something else?
Even Yu-hui, who you were infatuated with in the past, is head over heels for my boyfriend. Ha! Sung Shi-hyun burst into laughter.
I get that you're trying to piss me off, but that's just going too far. Skill in bed? Yu-hui is head over heels for him? Both of you like the same guy?
Ha ha ha. If you're going to make something up, at least make it.
However, he could not finish talking as Seo Yu-hui smiled brightly and clung to Sol Jihoo's left arm.
She gently leaned against his shoulder and gave a sweet smile.
Then, she spoke. She's telling the truth. Her expression was that of genuine happiness. The smile on Sung Shi-hyun's face vanished without a trace.
You?
Who the hell are you? What do you mean?
I didn't know you were such a double-faced bitch. Weren't you disgusted whenever you touched a man? Oh please. I was disgusted with you, but this man is my boyfriend. Of course, it's okay.
Quote.
Oh yeah. Remember the spirit beasts and the precious medicine you gave me as gifts? Seo Yu-hui smiled with her eyes. I didn't have much use for them, so I kept them in my storage. But I ended up letting my boyfriend eat everything.
That's okay, right? What? It shouldn't matter, right?
You gave it to me, after all.
Sol Jihoo coughed.
Was Nuna normally like this too?
He didn't know how much Seo Yu-hui hated Sung Shi-hyun, but now that he looked at it, she didn't lose to Baek Haiju. That wasn't all. Russell, who was quietly listening to this exchange, licked her lips. Soon, she descended from the sky, circled around Sol Jihoo, and then softly wrapped Un Yuri's arms around Sol Jihoo's face. Sorry, you're free to have a crush on me, but I also have a partner I promised my future with Tilda. The beauty mark under her eye stood out as she smiled coquettishly.
Phi Sora was sensible. With a grin, she spread her arms out and hugged Sol Jihoo from behind. Tilda. She didn't forget to stick out her tongue and make fun of Sung Shi-hyun. With no room to fit in, Agnes loitered around before coughing lightly and gently grabbing Sol Jihoo's sleeve. Aww. Surrounded by 5 women in an instant, Sol Jihoo rolled his eyes blankly. He understood why they were doing this, but he couldn't help himself from blushing. On the other hand, Sung Shi-hyun's face was a sight to behold. His face had stiffened so hard that it would shatter if anyone tapped on it lightly. Then again,
The women that he designated as his harem members were all clinging to another man and taunting him.
It made sense for him to react this way. Although this was only a figment of his imagination that had yet to be realized, Sung Shi-hyun was filled with the desire to achieve this dream in the near future. If Teresa, whom he designated as the third harem member, was here, that really would have put the nail in the coffin. "All right."
Sung Shi-hyun suddenly snapped out of his dazed state and muttered,
"That pissed me off." With a quiet murmur, he looked down at Sol Ji-hoo with eyes full of killing intent.
If looks could kill, his would have torn Sol Ji-hoo to shreds 1,000 times over.
"You all really are pushing it just because I joked around a bit."
A chilling voice flowed out.
"I was going to leave in peace for old time's sake. You brought this upon yourselves."
He fixed his grip on the sword while giving a menacing threat as if his pride was severely wounded.
"Fine.
Whether you're telling the truth or lying, I'll kill that little son of a bitch."
Let's see if you can laugh then." In the next moment, Sung Shi-hyun cut down fiercely in surprise. From the sword path, a wavering, crescent-shaped sword chi shot out and fell sharply. Chapter 345.
"Don't block it.
Avoid it."
Baek Haiju shouted, and the 5 women split simultaneously.
Sol Ji-hoo, who was dragged back by Baek Haiju,
widened his eyes in surprise.
He didn't hear any sound, not even an explosive pop. The white sword chi that reached the ground cut through the dirt and quietly disappeared inside. All that could be seen was a thin, severed cross-section. It was truly a terrifying cutting force.
At that moment, Sung Shi-hyun raised his longsword up, and Sol Ji-hoo's senses sent urgent alarm bells. As he shot back with a double take, lo and behold, a line was drawn where he just stood and something shot up from the ground. It was the same sword chi that had disappeared a moment ago.
"Little rat!" Sung Shi-hyun shot down towards Sol Ji-hoo while cutting the threads filled with holy power that were trying to coil around him.
Baek Haiju quickly cut in between the two, but Sung Shi-hyun vanished as though he expected it.
At the same time, Sol Ji-hoo's left arm moved automatically.
Ha! As the startled Sol Ji-hoo turned left, he saw Sung Shi-hyun, who appeared before he noticed, stabbing his longsword forward.
Clang! The spear that moved of its own accord struck the longsword before its blade stabbed into him.
The spear of purity seemed to have sensed danger and moved to protect its master.
Sol Ji-hoo was dumbfounded.
Not even Flash Thunder was able to follow Sung Shi-hyun's speed.
To react to his movements, Sol Ji-hoo could only predict them like before. "Be careful. He can switch positions with."
Baek Haiju shouted while quickly turning around. However, a strong doubt was cast over her eyes in an instant.
It was because Sung Shi-hyun instantly moved behind Sol Ji-hoo. Ethereal shift.
He used it consecutively?
Are you surprised? Sung Shi-hyun sneered at Baek Haiju while sliding towards Sol Ji-hoo.
Want me to tell you something? Beating back the attacking Oh-rahi and Phi Sora with a single attack, he rushed closer.
The divinity of undying diligence. I'm the one who ate it. Sol Ji-hoo's bangs flew back from the fierce gale that blew against him.
Widening his eyes, he hurriedly thrust his spear.
I even absorbed it fully.
Sung Shi-hyun grinned.
This is nothing. Pop! The air exploded, and the voice rang out behind Sol Ji-hoo.
Sung Shi-hyun was tilting the longsword in his left hand backward.
No. Watch out for this foot.
The shocked Sol Ji-hoo leaned back as he turned around. Something sharp brushed past the tip of his nose by a paper-thin margin. However, Sung Shi-hyun twisted his foot as soon as he missed his target and struck down with it again.
You-ah! A black smoke quickly intervened and just barely blocked the foot.
The hell is this?
Sung Shi-hyun got annoyed and shook his foot hard before striking down with the left hand that was tilted back. Along with an intense shockwave, the white sword pushed back Cho Hong's mace and Hugo's halberd flying in from both sides. Sung Shi-hyun then pointed the sword tip at Sol Ji-hoo and stabbed forward.
As Sol Ji-hoo followed his intuition to confront the attack, he strangely felt like dozens of longswords were lunging toward him from all angles. At that moment, a white barrier formed in front of him.
Tang, 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 tang. The barrier shook as it blocked the longsword.
Sol Ji-hoo wasn't mistaken.
Although the longsword struck at only one point of the barrier, several cracks appeared on it simultaneously.
Sung Shi-hyun's complexion distorted. God fucking damn it.
Boom, clang.
The barrier shattered to pieces, and the longsword emitting white sword chi broke inside.
When the longsword clashed violently with the spear blade, Sol Ji-hoo's eyes almost popped out.
Sung Shi-hyun's speed was one thing, but the powerful force that was unheard of tore Sol Ji-hoo's palms apart. Only after rousing his mana to the limit did the rapidly falling spear of purity stop. As Sol Ji-hoo sighed seeing the sword blade that had almost reached his nose, Sung Shi-hyun abruptly twisted the hand holding the sword.
The longsword and the spear crossed each other's path. Sol Ji-hoo felt like his spear was being sucked in.
At the same time, Sung Shi-hyun flicked his hand up. The spear of purity spun and flew into the air.
You know?
Sung Shi-hyun vanished in the middle of his speech. Agnes struck down on the spot that Sung Shi-hyun was in a beat late, then hurriedly looked over Sol Ji-hoo's shoulders.
Behind you. Light flashed the moment she yelled out. Sung Shi-hyun released his divinity to blow away Baek Haiju, who rushed in after reading his movement. He looked down at Sol Ji-hoo with an arrogant gaze while holding his longsword up.
You're nothing special.
The longsword fell as if to split Sol Ji-hoo's head in half. In that instant, Sung Shi-hyun furrowed his brows. Sol Ji-hoo was looking back at him. Talk. The longsword was stopped above his head. It refused to go down any further as if something invisible was blocking it. No way.
Recalling his own formless sword technique, Sung Shi-hyun dropped his jaw. It was then.
Shriek.
A bloodthirsty energy shot down toward his head. The spear of purity that he had sent flying was descending from the sky at a terrifying speed.
Flying spear.
Sung Shi-hyun hurriedly jumped back. The white spear brushed past his face by a thin margin and struck down on the ground. Then, he immediately saw Sol Ji-hoo pulling the spear out and rushing toward him.
Kook!
As Sol Ji-hoo sliced with the spear, Sung Shi-hyun grunted and activated Ethereal Shift.
He moved behind Sol Ji-hoo to attack him from the back, but he was shocked the instant he completed his movement. It was because Sol Ji-hoo turned back as if he had expected his movement. In an instant, the two men's faces drew closer.
You sure like to aim for people's backs. The meaning of Sol Ji-hoo's words was clear. He had predicted Sung Shi-hyun's movement despite being unable to read it. In the next instant, Sol Ji-hoo headbutted Sung Shi-hyun before he could use Ethereal Shift again. Ahoo! Sung Shi-hyun's head tilted back with a heavy thud as his face contorted with humiliation and shame. At the same time, he somersaulted back up and stabbed his longsword angrily. The white longsword clashed with the white spear that rushed in, and the formless sword blades and spear blades mingled together to form explosive thunders. I don't believe it. How can someone like you be in the same realm as me? Sung Shi-hyun fixed his posture before clenching his teeth and abruptly raising his eyes. Seeing Russell and Philip Muller, who were close to finishing their spells, he screamed in frustration. God damn it! He stretched out his arm, and his longsword enveloped in light elongated out. Hundreds of sword chi instantly rose up like a wave and rushed toward the two magicians, forcing them to unleash their spells in haste. Despite the two powerful magicians using their full strength, the storming wave of sword chi did not lose out in the slightest. In fact, it indiscriminately stabbed into the bitter cold storm and the sun like fireball and butchered them. Though Seo Yuhui soon pitched in and helped eradicate the three clashing attacks, this brief exchange showed Sung Shi-hyun's transcendental strength.
He was no longer comparable to when he was a human.
Sung Shi-hyun backed off a few more steps and shouted angrily.
"Aren't you gonna help?"
What? Can't you see I'm stopping the Arca spirit? Fucking hell, you can't even take care of a damn bird? Sung Shi-hyun grumbled and spat on the ground.
Vulgar Chastity looked completely dumbfounded.
She couldn't believe what he was saying when the duration of her divinity release was about to run out.
"You son of a bitch." However, Sung Shi-hyun didn't seem to care about the aftermath at all. He must be really pissed off as he was glaring at Sol Ji-hoo with killing intent.
Sol Ji-hoo also stared at him with a renewed gaze.
"He's strong, really strong."
That was his honest evaluation.
It wasn't just his swordsmanship that was impressive.
The way he used his body like a sword. He seemed to have profound knowledge over mixed martial arts. His character was childlike, but his strength was a step above anyone else he had met so far. Supposedly, it was difficult for him to find his match even when he was an earthling, so it made sense where his previous confidence came from after fully absorbing Diligence's divinity. Sol Ji-hoo even felt that his aura and potential were above that of twisted kindness.
On the other hand, Sung Shi-hyun was about to explode from frustration. He thought he had become invincible after receiving divinity.
He was even confident in crushing the 7th Army commander if he could fully control his energy. He finally had the strength to turn his wishful thinking into reality, so he couldn't help but explode with anger, not being able to take care of a single earthling.
"Who?"
Fixing his gaze on Sol Ji-hoo, Sung Shi-hyun let loose a deep breath and roused his energy even more. Then, the halo-like light on his back spread out brilliantly, and his white longsword quivered like a living creature.
Faint, wavering sword chi rose from his 5 fingers as well. "Good," Sung Shi-hyun muttered with an expressionless face. "Here's phase 2. Let's see if you can block my attacks again." Sol Ji-hoo clenched his teeth and tensed up at Sung Shi-hyun's threat. Although they were in an advantageous position, the current situation wasn't necessarily favorable for them. "We just need to hold out a little longer." It was at that moment. As Sung Shi-hyun took a deep breath and tried to release the energy he had roused up. Boom! His arm suddenly exploded. Sung Shi-hyun staggered to a stop while rushing forward. Awk! He grabbed the area that exploded with his remaining hand and fell on his knee.
What? His eyes widened, clearly flustered from the unexpected situation.
His mouth also dropped down. Weak!
And a mouthful of reddish-black blood gushed out. It didn't end at just once.
Twice, thrice, and a 4th time.
Vulgar Chastity shut her eyes as she moved to protect Sung Shi-hyun, who was vomiting out blood.
Idiot! Falling for such an obvious provocation. She had been on her toes the entire time, and her worries were proven to be well-founded.
Sung Shi-hyun's sorry state was the result of him using his divinity near the world tree while he wasn't used to controlling it.
Fuck! Sung Shi-hyun shook and barely eked out a word. You!
Baek Haiju, who originally thought somebody succeeded in delivering a sneak attack, flashed her eyes. Now that I think about it, you said you received Diligence's divinity?
Aha! Is that why you got so strong all of a sudden?
Sung Shi-hyun gritted his teeth and glared at her. You blabbered on so confidently, and this is the result?
You can't even control that power.
Sung Shi-hyun dropped his head at Baek Haiju's taunts.
Sol Ji-hoo clenched his fists hard. A golden opportunity had presented itself. Although he couldn't let his guard down just yet, if all went well, they might be able to kill both Vulgar Chastity and Sung Shi-hyun. But just as he thought so, Q-hoo-hoo-hoo!
Muffled laughter suddenly rang out.
Sung Shi-hyun was laughing quietly with his shoulders faintly trembling. Haiju!
Sung Shi-hyun struck up a conversation with his head face down. Do you remember the Imperial Oath expedition? What?
You know, the time we infiltrated the Empire. We went to find the token of the Gorgonu family that served the chief deity of paradise. You remember, right?
Baek Haiju furrowed her brows.
She remembered the expedition but couldn't understand why he was bringing it up now.
He might be trying to buy time, but that didn't make sense either, as every passing second would only make things more disadvantageous for him. The expedition was a success, but strictly speaking, it was only half successful.
Remember?
We thought we could banish the parasite queen from paradise at first.
But that wasn't the case.
We only limited the scope that the parasite queen could move in, and she could also remain in paradise. What are you trying to say? This is something I found out only after I turned to the parasites.
Did you know that the parasite queen is an existence that surpasses our wildest imaginations?
Sung Shi-hyun raised his head slightly. The mouth that was revealed twisted to a smile. Don't underestimate her. The parasite queen is a god. A literal god that is incomparable to the lowly seven sins.
Never mind a single planet, she is a lofty being who once reigned over an entire galaxy.
Sung Shi-hyun got up with a grunt.
He was still missing an arm and was swaying greatly. Thanks. His face wore a distorted smile. I got pissed off in the middle, but, thanks to that, I was able to buy time.
As Baek Haiju was about to retort, she subconsciously swallowed her words. Before anyone noticed, the battlefield had turned silent. The ruckus inside and outside the fortress had disappeared completely.
Moreover, everyone in the expedition team felt an indescribable sense of foreboding. It was as if something was filling up the area fully.
They felt an immeasurable being descending on the land, an existence so absurdly unfathomable that even the combined forces of the Federation, humanity, and even the parasites and the army commanders would not compare.
"I am the sky!" Maria screamed.
The expedition team, along with Sung Shi-hyun and Vulgar Chastity, turned toward the sky beyond Tiggle Fortress. Soon, everyone except Sung Shi-hyun became lost for words.
The sky was roaring. There was no other way to describe it.
An untimely vortex fused the clouds together, and the sky was twisting and wrinkling like a crumpled piece of paper. Then, after a moment of silence, Sol Ji-hoo realized that this phenomenon was centered around the image in the sky.
Although it was too distorted to be even called an image, he could faintly see a shadow inside it. Then, the shadow slowly grew closer. In the next moment, Sol Ji-hoo's skepticism was blown away as his breathing halted.
A dark gray leg that was surrounded by bones ripped through space and popped out of the image.
Vulgar Chastity drew a deep breath. Queen.
It was no hallucination.
Although the leg didn't seem all that big in the image, when it came into being, it was large enough to shame most wooden logs. Boom.
A shockwave rippled out just from the leg stepping on the air.
Cheek.
As soon as the leg stepped outside, large amount of vapor steamed up as if dry ice was placed inside water, or as if a scorching branding iron was pressed on tender flesh. White smoke frothed out, almost as if the world refused to let this thing exist in this space.
But there was one thing that was certain.
An existence, capable of temporarily ignoring the oath if it so desired, was trying to come into being in this place.
Right.
The parasite queen was descending on the battlefield.
Chapter 346. Tearing through space following the leg were two arms. Emerging in an outward motion as if to trot through a thicket, the goddess of parasitism finally showed herself. Slowly descending from the sky to the hill, she seemed to be about 4 to 5 meters tall. Her hair was made of tentacles, and her breasts were like 2 dinosaur eggs, supported by her bone armor. She had a gray exoskeleton that looked sturdy like a carapace, and her iron-like bone wings were connected to her shoulder joints. Right, the parasite queen descended on the battlefield. My queen. Vulgar Chastity trembled at a loss for words.
White, cloud-like steam was continuously rising up from the parasite queen's body, making it difficult to be seen.
Kung! The parasite queen recoiled after stepping on the hilltop. Her shoulders hunched over, her wings folded, and her back slowly curled in. Parts of her body contracted from moment to moment as if she had entered a compressor of some sort.
As if to endure this by force, the parasite queen convulsed violently.
"Why? Your Majesty!" Seeing the parasite queen in pain, exploding patients shouted with lamentation.
However, the parasite queen straightened her body at last and opened her burning mouth.
"Everyone!"
"Why yes, Your Majesty!" Exploding patients burst into tears. To the army commanders, their dearly revered queen appearing in this place had a special meaning. Apologetic from failing to perform their mission, they were greatly touched that the queen forced herself to descend to make up for their pathetic mistakes.
And soon, this emotion turned into a terrifying battle intent.
The queen had shaved off her life to take action, so how could they not risk their lives?
"Just give the command, Your Majesty. Even if I perish, I will take these lowly creatures with me."
Exploding patience burned her fighting spirit with blazing eyes.
Then, "Retreat."
She showed a dazed expression at the queen's next word.
She wasn't ordering an all-or-nothing battle, but a retreat?
Exploding patience doubted her ears as her mouth gaped open from disbelief. It was then.
"Kook!"
The parasite queen grunted shortly and hurriedly reached out her arm to where the nests were gathered farthest back. Immediately afterward, the army commanders were all shocked speechless.
Boom, 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 boom. The nests began to explode out of the blue.
Excluding the pinnacle-ranked nests, which were only a few in number, the lower-ranked, middle-ranked, and upper-ranked nests all exploded indiscriminately.
"Q Queen?"
Exploding patience was taken aback. The nests contained the queen's power, but they were also special in that they were seeds that originated from the planet she came from.
With the queen's planet destroyed, the nests were rare creatures that could not be replaced once lost.
That was why the parasites treated them like treasures, yet the queen was detonating the nests herself?
Why?
It wasn't until half of the nests detonated that exploding patience learned of the answer. The smoke rising from the queen's body slowly subsided until it died down completely.
"Ah!"
Exploding patience exclaimed. The parasite queen had retrieved the remnant divinity she bestowed to the nests and succeeded in temporarily weakening the oath shackling her down.
Of course, this was an extremely inefficient thing to do.
Sacrificing divinity just to step outside the Empire's territory meant her strength had diminished by that much.
Only, her intent was clear. Phew!
Breathing out a hot gust of air through her nose, the parasite queen calmly gazed at the battlefield. Suddenly, a self-deprecating laugh escaped her mouth. This was the first crushing defeat she suffered since the time she escaped to paradise after being cut down by the martial god.
Military forces, divinity, and future. She suffered tremendous losses in all aspects and would continue to suffer more damages. However, the parasite queen did not blame others. Everything was the result of her wrong choices. Moreover, she was the leader of the parasites before being the chief deity of this planet.
As the queen who commanded all parasites, it was her duty to take responsibility for this defeat. As everyone's gazes remained fixed on her, the parasite queen straightened her back.
She stood tall and spread out her bone wings. Then, she spread out her arms and released her divinity.
The dignified presence of the parasite queen, who once ruled over countless planets of a galaxy in the far mythical era, returned to life in this place.
Kia!
Along with a sudden ear-splitting, high-pitched scream, terrifying energy that could not be measured struck down on the land. The hill that the queen was standing on sunk in and a chunk of land was instantly torn to shreds.
Only then did a frightening explosion erupt. Quang! In an instant, everyone's vision became blurred. It was because a sun had risen from the spot where the queen was standing.
To be precise, flames had erupted out, but the scale of the explosion was enough to make anyone think that the sun had risen up. UCK. Sol Ji-hoo reflexively crossed his arms in front of his face and furrowed his brows. His shaking field of vision faintly caught sight of a mushroom cloud that had shot up to the sky. Next, debris mixed with smoke rose from the site of the heaving explosions. It was at that moment. The sun-like fireball expanded in size by a dozen times. Rumble. Quang. Quang. The hill then collapsed, and a fierce heat wave mixed with dirt erupted out. The chained explosions that started before anyone noticed bombarded the spacious battlefield and reached Tiggle Fortress in an instant. Tang, tang, tang. Sol Ji-hoo drew a deep breath at the ear-punching din. Debris struck the barriers that Seo Yuhui, Russell, Philip Muller, and Maria created with all their might. However, they burned down in the next moment, and the fiery debris quickly closed in. Beads of sweat formed on Sol Ji-hoo's forehead. He felt like his flesh was being melted by the intense heat wave. Despite a barrier protecting him, his skin heated up like it was being cooked. The destructive power of the Parasite Queen's outburst was simply too terrifying. However, this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Ah! The sky flipped over in a split second. That was the only way Sol Ji-hoo could describe what just happened as his vision shook crazily. Other members of the expedition team were also screaming and swaying violently. Having struck his spear into the ground to maintain his balance, Sol Ji-hoo was dumbfounded by what he saw next. The world was upside down. The fortress, the world tree, and even the mountain range were dangling from the sky as if they would fall at any moment. He even saw people who were actually falling upside down. He couldn't tell whether the world had actually inverted or if he was just seeing things this way due to his own positioning. However, he clearly felt like the law of gravity existing in this world was reversed at this moment. Inside this burning purgatory where everything had turned topsy-turvy, it didn't take long for the already chaotic battlefield to turn into a pandemonium. Still, what drove Sol Ji-hoo to the end of his wits was something else. D. The sky flipped over a moment ago, and now the earth had begun to shake. Almost as if there was an earthquake. Seooljiihu. Then, a howl echoed out. Quang! Quang! Followed by ear-splitting explosions. Pillars of lava shot up from the surroundings like dragons ascending to the sky. The nearby volcanoes reacted to the Queen's rage and began to explode. The land cracked like farmland bogged down by drought, forming a massive spiderweb that stretched across the entire battlefield. The cracks eventually came together, forming a deep fissure that cut the hill and the fortress apart. Boiling lava then gushed out from the fissure and coursed around like a river. Sol Ji-hoo was completely taken by surprise. A huge explosion, a sky that turned upside down, and a rumbling ground. With heaven and earth going through such massive changes in the blink of an eye, he wanted to just let go of everything. While he was holding out with superhuman endurance, he suddenly caught sight of two beings floating in the end. One was Sung Shi-hyun, who was still missing an arm and vomiting out fresh blood. The other was Vulgar Chastity, who was helping him up. Neither of them looked to be particularly well off. Sung Shi-hyun was panting heavily with his remaining arm around Vulgar Chastity's shoulders. Vulgar Chastity must have cancelled her divinity release as she had returned to her original appearance. Although their faces were ashen and pale, they seemed unaffected by the hell that was breaking loose. Just like how Russell's area of effect magic only affected the parasites, the two of them didn't seem to be affected by the Parasite Queen's energy. Sol Ji-hoo's eyes made contact with those of Vulgar Chastity's. Soon, Vulgar Chastity turned around without hesitation. Flapping her wings, she brought Sung Shi-hyun away from the fortress.
Sol Jihu instinctively reached toward the two escaping army commanders, but it was in vain.
Then,
"Kook!"
the high-pitched voice that was ringing out endlessly suddenly stopped. The parasite queen's eyes shot open.
"Kiyu!" Her breathing got heavy and she was struck with an intense headache.
A stream of black blood spurted out of her nose, but she did not perceive it as an intense pain twisting her insides suddenly came down on her.
She bit down on her trembling lips. "Kakook! Kakook!"
The parasite queen was making considerable efforts to hold it in, but reddish-black blood spurted out from between her lips. Eventually, she collapsed while vomiting out a black liquid.
"Kiyu! Cough! Cough! Cough!"
"Why, your majesty!" Exploding Patience, having released her divinity, shot toward the hill that had sunken in like a volcanic crater. Seeing the vomiting queen, she was at a loss for what to do. The body that had cooled down also showed signs of heating up.
"Stop!"
Seeing the wavering hazes rising up from different parts of the queen's body, Exploding Patience tapped her toes nervously. The parasite queen raised her head with great difficulty. Exploding Patience had arrived, and abhorrent charity and unsightly humility were controlling the nests to make them retreat.
Vulgar Chastity and Sung Shi-hyun were also flying across the battlefield toward them. She let loose a long sigh.
That is enough. Although she had to pay a price that could not be ignored, she achieved her goal.
The parasite queen staggered up.
There was only one thing left to do.
Retreat.
The parasite queen turned around without hesitation.
She flew up, spreading her creaking wings open.
Just like that, the parasite's forces began to retreat amidst the chaos of the battlefield.
At one point, they filled the sky and dyed the world in their colors, but now they followed the queen who flew toward the setting sun. Asterisk.
The endlessly ringing high-pitched voice stopped abruptly. The explosions gradually died down, the reversed gravity returned to normal, and the rumbling of the earth disappeared. After much wobbling, Sol Jihu narrowly grabbed a hold of his balance. As his blurred vision came into focus, what first entered his line of sight was an empty sky. Neither Vulgar Chastity nor Sung Shi-hyun could be seen.
It was as if he had a short nightmare. Sol Jihu then heard the ruckus outside after standing still like a stone statue for a while. Ah! In the next moment, he ran out like a bolt of lightning. He heard someone calling him from behind but didn't look back. He focused solely on chasing after the escaping parasites. He just had a feeling he should. Using flash thunder to leave the fortress in an instant, Sol Jihu became lost for words immediately. The battlefield was so chaotic that calling it a mess would be an understatement. The dense mushroom cloud was still hovering in the air, and a burning heat wave was rising from the barren wasteland that didn't have a single tuft of grass remaining. The baked ground cracked further with each step he took, and the scorched dirt gave off an acrid smoke as it smoldered. With lava flowing all over the place, the area could only be described as a living hell. It was as if he was seeing the immediate aftermath of a nuclear war. If it wasn't for Afinu odor and Diffidum odor along with the 5 spirit kings and other spirits, risking their lives to lessen the damage, and the world tree frantically defending everyone, the ones remaining on this battlefield would have turned to ash a long time ago. This is the true power of a god. Sol Jihu finally realized why Sung Shi-hyun was so confident. The army commanders were simply incomparable. The true power of the parasite queen, who was said to be high-ranked even among the numerous gods, was enough to instill fear and terror in anyone watching. Sol Jihu swallowed hard but soon shook off the thought. Something was off about her, what with the smoke and all. Paradise should have fallen to the parasite queen's hands long ago if she could exert such power every time. The fact that it still hadn't meant that there was some sort of restriction shackling her down. In that case, the story was different. If his conjecture was right, the queen must have suffered a great loss to make herself descend in this place. To preserve the army commanders and her plans for the future even at the risk of hurting herself. Sol Jihu rubbed his tingling nose and gazed at the far distance.
He couldn't see the parasite queen or the army commanders, but beyond the horizon revealed by the sunken hill, he saw faint movements of the retreating parasite's forces.
"Are you the human who revived the world tree?" At that moment, a husky voice rang out next to him. A maned beastman with a half-burnt face raised his body with a grunt.
Then, he asked, "Will you let them escape?"
Sol Jihu blinked at the sudden question. "Or will you chase after them?"
But hearing the next question, strength entered his eyes. The beastman grinned, having understood Sol Jihu's intention just by the glint in his eyes.
"So we're thinking along the same lines." The human-like figure then suddenly transformed into a large beast.
Its silk-like mane fluttering, the black stripes on its white body made it look like a white tiger. The beastman stood on its 4 legs and glanced down.
"Hop on."
Sol Jihu jumped on without a moment of hesitation.
"Hold on tight."
The white tiger then shot forward. Sol Jihu's eyes widened. Though he was expecting it to a degree, he almost fell from the blazing speed of the beastman. But soon, he lowered his upper body and sharpened his gaze.
He had no intention of letting the parasites escape so easily. Rather, he couldn't let them. And so, while everyone was in a flurry from the chaos, only Sol Jihu riding the white tiger cut through the battlefield like a ray of light. The first one to notice was Hao Win. After arriving at Tiggle Fortress, he had jumped into the fray, leading the triads in following the cavalry. He was breathing a sigh of relief after narrowly surviving, thanks to the World Tree, when he saw Sol Jihu chasing after the enemy by himself and made a shocked expression. However, he grinned in the next moment.
Again, he's running while only looking straight ahead.
"Ming Jia, will you chase after him?"
"What choice do I have?" He says he's not satisfied with just the appetizer and the main dish.
"I'm personally full. I mean, they're escaping, aren't they? Is there a reason to?" Now, let's be polite to the chef preparing the course. We might as well enjoy the dessert since we made it this far."
Hao Win chuckled before picking up his sword and shield and running after Sol Jihu.
With a sigh, Ming Jia rallied the triads and followed Hao Win. "Not enough, huh?"
Gabriel was the same.
Sweeping up her silver hair that was muddled with ash, she spread her wings.
They weren't the only ones. Those who watched Sol Jihu pursuing the enemy with a frightening spirit got up at once as though they'd been bewitched. Paradisians, Earthlings, and the foreign races of the Federation all followed Sol Jihu as he charged ahead.
And so, the time that had frozen began to flow again.
So what I'm saying is,
although Sol Jihu was unaware,
don't you have any thoughts about becoming a king? This scene.
It sounds nice. Where everyone was following him, the one who was spearheading the charge. To become king was just like seeing a king, leading his army, and charging through the battlefield. Chapter 347. An uproar erupted behind them. The army commanders looked back one after another and lamented in unison.
Their worst fear had become a reality. The enemies were pursuing them with great tenacity, clearly unperturbed by the queen's power. Seeing the fallen angels and sky fairies rushing at her like a swarm of bees, Exploding Patience hurriedly ordered the remaining parasites and corpse army to charge. Unsightly Humility also sent out the Death Knights and what was remaining of his undead army. They hoped to buy even a little bit of time, but the result was unsatisfactory. There were just too few of their forces left to last long enough against the Federation. A dazzling golden light flashed, and immediately, a large opening formed in the battle line. Exploding Patience frowned when she saw Sol Jihu racing across the battlefield, smashing his way through the center. "Why, Your Majesty?" The Parasite Queen did not answer. Exploding Patience looked extremely guilty. She couldn't believe that the Queen had to suffer such humiliation because of herself and the other army commanders. After a moment of silence, the Parasite Queen spoke.
Leave the mother species behind.
All of them. Pardon? All of them?
Yes. Including medusas, temerators, and reginas. But I can understand medusas, but abandoning all three is.
Exploding Patience hesitated.
She knew that mother species were difficult to produce unlike ordinary parasites. The upper-ranked and pinnacle-ranked ones were even more so. We don't have any choice. But the queen was persistent. Carrying the nests is difficult enough. We can always produce new mother species at a later time.
Right now, their presence is getting in the way of our retreat.
Under the present circumstances, the queen was right.
Though still concerned about the aftermath, Exploding Patience chose to remain silent. At the same time, she felt frustrated.
Even though Her Majesty went to such great lengths to descend. This proved that the situation they were in was far too dangerous. In the end, they had to give up all of their mother species.
Medusa, temerators, reginas, and the others roared furiously as they began to spew out parasites.
There were quite a lot of them.
They had led a huge army into this war from the get-go, and on top of that, the nests had been giving birth non-stop. Protected in the rear, which had been relatively safe throughout the war, the mother species had naturally increased in number.
Tisk. They sure are desperate.
The white tiger beastman clicked his tongue. The sacrificial parasites and corpses were easy to kill, but the mother species were a different story. They were the strongest, the most evolved forms of their ranks. Ganged together, they posed a major threat.
The parasites they produced also couldn't be ignored.
What are you going to do?
White Tiger asked, raising his head slightly. We can't break through that.
We'll have to fight. White Tiger spoke evasively, but Sol Jihu understood that under the present circumstances he wouldn't be able to capture the parasite queen. Sol Jihu bit his lip nervously.
He hadn't expected the queen to abandon all mother species. Of course, exterminating the mother species would be a big achievement on its own. However, no. It simply wasn't as appetizing as the parasite queen. Sol Jihu had already forgotten the army commanders. All he could think about was the parasite queen, and nothing else. The one who ruined paradise was only a few steps away from him. He knew he couldn't let her get away intact. If only he could get past that assembly of mother species, he would get a better view of the parasite queen. But how would he do that? Even as Sol Jihu wondered, the distance between him and the enemy was rapidly diminishing. The mother species seemed determined to take all risks to stop him, and the parasites they spouted were beginning to fill his view. There's no way I'll be able to shatter that. Then, there was only one thing he could do. Sol Jihu clenched his teeth. It's either do or die.
He yelled resolutely.
Stop. Okay. Thinking they had no other choice, White Tiger immediately slowed down.
At this point it seemed impossible for them to catch up with the parasite queen. He thought it better to join forces with the rest of the team and destroy the mother species for good. That in itself would be a considerable achievement.
And so, White Tiger stopped with flexibility unbefitting of his large stature. It was then that he felt the weight of the foot pressing down on his back. Tong!
Ha! White Tiger unwittingly looked up and was shocked. He saw Sol Jihu soaring into the air as if he had been pushed forward by a great force.
You! For a moment, White Tiger thought Sol Jihu had lost his mind. Medusas alone were over 4 meters tall, and temerators and reginas were twice as tall as medusas. Above all, the sky was full of flying creatures.
There was no way Sol Jihu could leap over all of them.
But then, White Tiger doubted his eyes. Sol Jihu was moving in a straight line, not a curve, up towards the sky from where White Tiger stood. This meant he wasn't trying to leap over, but rather spark.
At that moment, electricity engulfed Sol Jihu's entire body as he soared into the sky once again.
For a brief period of time, Sol Jihu was above all the mother species. And as a result,
Quote exclamation mark quote.
He could finally see. Nothing else was a concern to him right now.
He focused all his senses on the parasite queen, who was deeply wounded and bleeding. The moment he laid eyes on her, just as he reached the apex and was about to fall, in that brief moment, Sol Ji-hoo's mind went blank.
He reached the peak of his concentration and fell into a trance.
Turn your arm. The only thing he could hear was Zhang Maldong's voice in his head, and his body moved of its own accord. I meant your right arm.
Turn it clockwise halfway.
He turned his right forearm exactly halfway, bending it back greatly. Start at your feet, then move on to your left arm. He began twisting his left arm, starting from the tip of his finger, and let the movement flow all the way to his right arm. His right arm absorbed the rotational force and began moving forward.
Now! Sol Ji-hoo opened his eyes wide.
His right arm quickly shot forward. The exploding sensation that began in the palm of his hand spread all over his right arm in an instant. His spear felt so flexible that it was like a fish out of water, wriggling away from his hand.
He'd never thrown a spear in the air before. His physical condition wasn't perfect either. Above all, his target was far away.
But somehow Sol Ji-hoo looked extremely satisfied as he watched the spear of purity fly through the air past all the flying creatures.
Ha! Even White Tiger, the Beastman King, couldn't help but admire his comrade's flawless posture. It's perfect. The king thought unwittingly. Whoosh! The beam of light, surrounded by electricity, crossed the sky diagonally.
The distance between the spear and its target quickly approached zero until there was none. So the moment the spear pierced exactly where the target was about to pass, the parasite queen raised her head, realizing that something was wrong. Sol Ji-hoo had poured everything he had into this single shot. But the parasite queen's face remained expressionless.
She appeared calm and composed. The reason was that the spear was already there the moment she raised her head. Swish!
It began at the top of her head and went down to her forehead, nose, mouth, and finally to her chin. The sharpened spearhead drew a straight line. At the same time, intense pain overtook the queen. The expressionless face twisted in agony.
Ellipsis ellipsis exclamation mark. Crimson blood flowed out of the vertical line drawn from the top of her head to the bottom of her chin.
The parasite queen's face began twitching.
She finally realized what had happened. She was extremely lucky to have raised her head at just the right time.
If she hadn't, the spear would have penetrated her head and split her in half.
Thinking of such a possibility. Ah!
The queen felt a chill run down her spine.
Her head throbbed with pain.
The parasite queen's eyes dilated with fear as she unwittingly turned her gaze to Sol Ji-hoo.
Coincidentally, the pain reminded her of the past.
She recalled the painful and humiliating experience in which her whole body was split in half by a single movement of the martial god's sword. It was then, "Your Majesty." Vulgar Chastity's voice brought the queen to her senses. But even before she could pull herself together, a new fear struck her. The spear, which she thought she had avoided, was coming up again towards her throat. The sudden memory of her past had forced her to let her guard down for a moment. That was clearly her mistake. Her jaw slowly dropped.
Swish! The parasite queen flinched. Blood spattered the queen's face.
And then, she heard an ear-splitting shriek.
Awk! She saw the spear of purity pierce Sung Shi-hyun.
What happened was that vulgar Chastity had panicked when she saw the spear move again and unwittingly threw Sung Shi-hyun, whom she had been carrying, towards the spear.
You crazy bitch! Sung Shi-hyun, who had involuntarily become the queen's shield, screamed as he fell. I'll get him!
Your Majesty, you must hurry!
Breathing heavily, vulgar Chastity flew towards Sung Shi-hyun in a hurry. The queen looked forward again. Her wings began to flap slowly.
With clenched teeth, she focused all her senses on running away.
She feared that if she didn't get out of here quickly, she'd get split in half again. And so, shivering with humiliation, she fled without looking back as she did then. Asterisk. Damn it. Kung. Sol Ji-hoo pounded the ground with his fist as soon as he landed.
He was confident of his success until the parasite queen raised her head at the very last moment.
It wasn't even close. His spear definitely reached her. It just wasn't strong enough to penetrate her. The rest of the army passed by him. He heard the footsteps of soldiers rushing towards the mother species, the metallic clangs of their weapons, and the cries of the parasites and mother species. But Sol Ji-hoo remained still on his knees. He had poured everything he had into that last attack. He was tired, but what bothered him more than fatigue was the fact that he failed to capture the queen. I missed my chance. It was a miraculous chance created by a combination of coincidence and luck. He could have annihilated the army commanders. And it wasn't every day the parasite queen paid a visit to the battlefield. This could have been the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to end the long war. Damn it! As the cries of the mother species dwindled, Sol Ji-hoo punched the ground again. All the while time continued to pass, and the battle was slowly coming to an end. The mother species were powerful, but not powerful enough to defeat the endless rush of soldiers. The best they could do was stall for time. And shortly afterward, with the last Regina falling with a thud, the mother species were completely annihilated. The battlefield erupted in cheers. The deafening roar reverberated through the air. Everyone witnessed the dreadful parasites and their queen flee for their lives. When they came, they dyed the whole mountain range gray. But when they left, they had lost everything except the army commanders and nests. Today would go down in history as a great victory. Gabriel, after confirming that the battle was over, hurried to the star of this great victory. Even then Sol Ji-hoo still had his head down. He must really be disappointed. Gabriel smiled at the human's seemingly bottomless thirst for victory. At the same time his tenacity scared her a little. Despite his great achievements, he didn't seem satisfied at all. Gabriel gave a little cough to attract Sol Ji-hoo's attention. Thank you. You did really well. Quote. I saw that last attack. You were so close. Quote. It's too bad, but we still won. How long are you going to stay that way? Sol Ji-hoo slowly raised his head. Gabriel gave him a gentle smile. Sol Ji-hoo stared at Gabriel, who was ruffling her silver hair in a manner unbefitting of a holy angel. It's not like the war is completely over. Sol Ji-hoo's eyes lit up. Ah! He stumbled to his feet. She was right. The enemy retreated, but that did not mean the war was over. There remained a much more important issue than that. Suddenly, Sol Ji-hoo remembered his comrades and looked around. Most were busy rejoicing, but there was one spot that was oddly noisy. There, some soldiers were pulling at what looked like a tower. Harem's infantry? He spotted Jan Sanctus in the crowd. It seemed that he and his men had joined the chase and helped defeat the last wave of the parasites. But why are they all gathered in one place? Neither the general nor the soldiers looked happy. It can't be. Sol Ji-hoo pushed his way through the crowd only to be greeted by the cruel reality. He gasped in disbelief. What he thought to be a tower was actually a Medusa's body. And there was a familiar figure underneath it. Princess? Teresa Hussey. As crimson blood slowly drenched the ground where she lay, Sol Ji-hoo fell to his knees. Prin. Her glossy pink-colored hair was soaked with parasite fluids, and her face and her armor were spattered with blood. This made it a bit difficult to recognize her at first, but the girl lying in the pool of blood was definitely Teresa. Holding on to faint hope, Sol Ji-hoo placed his finger under Teresa's nose. But she wasn't breathing. What happened? Sol Ji-hoo glanced around, demanding an explanation. Well. One of the soldiers stammered nervously.
We're not sure, sir. We defeated all the parasites and moved on to the mother species. And then we heard the princess scream. Sol Jihu's heart sank again. That meant she was alive until the parasite queen fled.
And that she died during the final chase. Princess. Teresa looked so peaceful with her eyes closed. Sol Jihu's hand was shaking noticeably. They were in a war, and a massive one at that. He knew it was ridiculous to hope no one would die. However, he had hoped Teresa would be an exception. He wanted her to live. Sol Jihu reached out his trembling hand and caressed Teresa's cheek. It was then that a deep voice rang out behind him. Why don't you hurry up and move the damn thing? The princess is gonna suffocate. Sol Jihu looked back. Jan Sanctus was clicking his tongue with an annoyed expression on his face. When he turned his head again, he saw the princess glancing at him with only one eye open. Their eyes met. Who? He heard a breathing sound. I'm alive. Teresa chirped playfully. Princess? Ah. You see, I was fighting the Medusa when a cockroach suddenly jumped at me from behind. Princess? I must have missed it the first time. Anyway, it took me by surprise, and I was rolling on the ground to get it off when the Medusa fell on top of me. Princess? So I've been stuck here ever since, and these soldiers have been trying to pull me out. Then I saw you coming towards me. Teresa's voice slowly faded to a whisper. She noticed that Sol Jihu's expression was rapidly getting cold. Well, you know, I've suffered a lot because of that contract, too. Observatio vitae, I mean. So, the princess mumbled in a small voice, averting her eyes. She blinked quickly and glanced again at Sol Jihu. Slowly, her lips pursed. How about a kiss? Sol Jihu stared at Teresa with a blank face before bending over and headbutting her across the face. A squeal escaped Teresa's lips. Ow! That was mean. Tears welled up in her eyes as she rubbed her forehead. Good. You did good. Jan Sanctus gave Sol Jihu a pat on the shoulder. You scared me, for real. Sol Jihu lay on the ground with his limbs stretched out. It felt like the latest incident had taken years off of his life. As his body cooled down, weariness set in. Sol Jihu looked up at the night sky with eyes full of fatigue. The orange tinge of sunset was already fading from the quiet sky. All that happened a few hours ago, when the sky was dyed in various colors, seemed like a lie for a moment. Is it over? For real? Overtaken by a sense of unfamiliarity, he asked himself. It was a strange feeling. What should he call it? Confused? Nervous? Somehow none of this felt real. He hadn't had a day off since he went over to the spirit realm. Just lying here doing nothing made him feel strange. It took long enough. The cheers were still going on. The cries of joy mixed with cheers helped him realize that their victory was, in fact, real. Sol Jihu relaxed slightly and drew a long breath. We really won. It was finally starting to set in. Yes, the Federation and humanity were victorious. Together, they defeated the parasites in an all-out war. They stopped the fall of paradise. Though, more precisely, what they did was press the pause button. The parasite queen would surely come up with another scheme, but at least they successfully avoided the inevitable destruction that would follow after the fall of Tiggle Fortress. It's over. Sol Jihu's eyes slowly closed from extreme fatigue. The sky, which was colored crimson only a few minutes ago, had moved on to a calmer indigo as night fell. A star? He thought he saw a twinkling star, but his view soon became blurred. Amidst the cheers and the voices of his comrades calling his name, Sol Jihu closed his eyes. A faint smile crossed his lips as he fell into a deep sleep. Instead of the moon, a strikingly bright star shone down on Sol Jihu lying in the field. Chapter 348.
With the parasite queen's appearance and escape, the enemies had retreated from Tiggle Fortress completely.
However, the war wasn't over yet. The all-important post-war handling needed to be done. The lively atmosphere quickly died down.
A festive celebration might seem appropriate given that this was an unprecedented, great victory since the appearance of the parasites, with even the parasite queen personally fleeing.
However, now simply wasn't the time for such a thing. Although the enemy suffered a near annihilation of their ordinary troops, the Federation and humanity also suffered serious damage. Tiggle Fortress quickly grew busy.
The Allied forces first took care of the wounded.
Those who could still move all helped out. A medical relief station was set up inside the fortress to treat the wounded, and the Allied forces quickly worked to carry the wounded inside. During this time, there was no such distinction as foreign race or external faction. Beastmen supported humans up, and Earthling priests healed beastmen readily. It was a scene that no one would have expected to see in the past. Once the wounded were all moved inside, the Allied forces collected the corpses of the dead and cleaned up the battlefield. By then, the night had passed and the day entered early morning. Damn! I was wondering where she was. Why the hell was she lying still in the middle of the fortress? Phi Sora grumbled after coming back from throwing Hoshino Urara in the medical relief station. Chohong, who was resting her exhausted body outside her tent, stared at Phi Sora fixedly. I'm talking about her. The crazy chick. Phi Sora muttered meekly. Chohong nodded her head, thinking, oh, her. Then, she smirked. Didn't she fall after meeting Bulgur Shassidy's eyes? I don't know, my memory is a blur. Oh right, where's our representative? Chohong gestured toward the tent in front of her as she put a cigarette in her mouth. Sol Jihu was found unconscious on the field and was moved to the medical relief station before just being transferred to Valhalla's tent. He wasn't in any serious condition. He had simply passed out from exhaustion. The only reason he lasted so long was probably thanks to the World Tree revitalizing the expedition team before transporting them to the Middle World. Ha! Phi Sora snorted after peeking inside the tent. Sol Jihu was dead asleep while giving his left arm to Teresa Hussey and right arm to Charlotte Aria as pillows. Like the saying, having flowers in each hand, Sol Jihu had a princess on one hand and a queen on the other. After staring fixedly, Phi Sora pulled up the blanket that was half kicked off. Then, she turned back quietly. They sure are sleeping soundly while everyone else is working their butts off. Although she was complaining, she didn't think so at all on the inside. If anything, she felt pity seeing him collapse into sleep the moment the war ended. He must have pushed himself pretty hard. The two of them stood in completely different positions in this war. Phi Sora was only a member while Sol Jihu was a representative. She only had to follow orders, but Sol Jihu was the one who planned and carried out the entire plan. Looking back, this war was a series of dangers from the get-go. Even Phi Sora felt her heart sink on multiple occasions, nearing despair. She couldn't begin to fathom with what kind of mindset Sol Jihu must have endured the pressure on his shoulders as the person who planned and led the entire expedition. This was especially so given the number of times the situation took unexpected turns. That was what made her all the more sorry. Arg, I'm tired as hell but can't sleep. Phi Sora scratched her head in frustration before plopping down next to Chohong. After staying silent for a while, she spoke as if she'd just thought of something. Anyway, I wonder how that Uni and Miss Un Yuri are doing. It's been an hour or two since they left, right? We got a call from Kazuki a while ago. Oh really? What did he say? Un Yuri survived for now. As for Lust Nunam. Chohong sighed in the middle of talking. They're rushing to Eva, so we'll have to wait to find out. Phi Sora sighed and dropped her head. I don't know if we should tell our representative that. Don't. Quote. He's going to find out later anyway. Let him sleep for now. He was running around like a headless chicken even before the war to make preparations.
Cho-hong trailed off.
Phi Sora looked at her in a renewed way. She thought Cho-hong was just a tomboy, but it seemed she was more thoughtful than Phi Sora previously thought.
What about you? Are you okay?
Me? Why? You've had this dazed face since a while ago.
Did you know your cigarette burned out? Cho-hong glanced down. The cigarette in her mouth had flickered off before she noticed, leaving only ash behind.
Only then did she take out the cigarette and laugh.
It's just. Yes.
I don't know.
I feel dazed like you said.
Cho-hong smacked her lips, licking her chapped lips.
Maybe I should say I'm still in disbelief. When she added, that I survived in this war, Phi Sora nodded while looking up at the night sky above the fortress wall.
I don't blame you. It was a pretty absurd war, especially at the end with the parasite queen appearing. Phi Sora winced, recalling the event that happened only a few hours ago.
Cho-hong's face also paled. It's over, right?
Beats me. To be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if they suddenly jump over that wall.
Don't speak it into existence.
Cho-hong nudged her with her shoulder.
Phi Sora fell to the side feebly, then let out an empty chuckle. Well, you never know. If they come, they come. But, to be honest, I don't think they will.
Right?
Didn't they run with their tails between their legs? That's what I heard too.
If they were going to regroup and attack, they probably wouldn't have thrown away their mother species. Right, that makes sense. So I can sleep in peace then.
Let me just finish this.
Cho-hong simpered as she took out another cigarette. Phi Sora also got up and moved to the tent. She entered, thinking, he's already got 2 women clinging to him, so he won't cling to me today, right?
But when she looked inside the tent, her eyes widened. There was no one between the queen and the princess.
Shit.
Sol Ji-hoo disappeared?
Suddenly, a chilly night breeze seeped in. Rustle. Something was pushed inside by the wind and touched Phi Sora's foot as she stood motionless like a statue. Her eyes lit up as she glanced down.
This is a leaf.
The wind blew again. Phi Sora raised her eyes after subconsciously picking up the leaf.
A small part of the tent had been torn, just enough to carry out a person who was lying down.
Phi Sora crawled through the hole just to be sure and immediately furrowed her brows. There really was a long trail of someone being dragged left on the ground. Someone must have taken Sol Ji-hoo while she was talking with Chung Cho-hong. But who? And for what reason? Swallowing the questions that began to surface, Phi Sora followed the trail until her gaze stopped at the center of the fortress where the large world tree was standing. She then looked back and forth between the leaf in her hand and the world tree. Ha! And her eyes shot open. She seemed to have realized something. Asterisk. Fresh sunlight shone down on his face. Sol Ji-hoo tossed and turned without even opening his eyes. Although he regained consciousness, he didn't want to wake up. He wanted to enjoy the refreshing wind and the cozy warmth enveloping him for a little while longer. Other than something continuously tickling his cheek, everything was comfortable and relaxing. Is someone licking me or something?
Grumbling inwardly, Sol Ji-hoo suddenly frowned.
Wait, is that wind?
A pleasant wind blew once again.
Feeling his back becoming cool, Sol Ji-hoo opened his eyes. He saw leaves and branches messily blocking the sun hanging in the middle of the sky. This is... It was only then that Sol Ji-hoo realized he wasn't in the tent.
Branches and leaves were weaved together like a net, supporting his body like a bed.
Simply put, he had been sleeping in the world tree's embrace.
It was hard to believe that he sleepwalked all the way up this large tree, and it seemed even more unlikely that someone would have done something as insane as putting him up here.
Did you bring me here? Of course, the world tree didn't answer. It only moved its branch and hugged Sol Ji-hoo tightly. Tickle, tickle. Meanwhile, a leaf continued to tickle his cheek. Soon,
The world tree lifted the head, tilting Sol Jihu up high so that he could look outside.
"Ah!" Sol Jihu exclaimed loudly. Looking down from the highest point in the surrounding land filled him with a new emotion.
A beautiful, splendid view was spread out before him. So much so that he doubted whether it was even the same place as where a brutal war broke out yesterday. "You wanted to show me this?"
The world tree rustled. Though he might be mistaken,
it felt like the world tree was laughing brightly.
The world tree must have wanted to show him this scenery.
Sol Jihu also burst out laughing. Then, after looking around for a while, he caught sight of something and exclaimed, "Oh!" He saw two little dots looking up at him from the bottom of the world tree. Though there was a bit of a distance between them, Sol Jihu's eyesight, heightened from the golden winged phoenix, captured them instantly.
It was the Foxman sisters, Harem and Heya. "Let me down." Sol Jihu descended slowly. "Woo!" The sisters cheerfully came running as soon as he stepped on the ground. "It's been a while."
They giggled brightly as Sol Jihu picked them up with a greeting. "What are you guys so happy about?" "We won. We won yesterday."
"Oh, that."
"Yeah, the parasite queen ran away."
I saw.
"See, I told you, the parasites are nothing much."
Sol Jihu glanced sideways while chatting casually.
Harem and Heya weren't the only ones here. There were 6 pairs of twinkling, bead-like eyes that were staring at him. White and yellow rice cakes were hiding behind the world tree, peeking at him with their tails wagging.
The little fuzzballs looked docile like puppies from a rural countryside.
When their eyes met Sol Jihu's, one of the white rice cakes mustered up its courage and came up to him.
Wagging its tail, the rice cake went on tippy toes in front of Sol Jihu.
The way it poked his leg and stuck out its tongue, it seemed to be asking for a hug.
"Ooh!" Sol Jihu put the sisters down before getting on his knees.
He reached out to the white fuzzball and ah! It was soft and warm like a rice cake that was just cooked. "Aw! You guys come here too." As Sol Jihu beckoned at the others, the 5 others that were staring yearningly flashed their eyes.
They rushed over with short and quick steps, then surrounded Sol Jihu while wagging their tails.
"Haha, you little fuzzballs."
In the next moment, Sol Jihu yelled, "Boo!" and jumped.
He grabbed a rice cake in his line of sight and bit down gently. The rice cake wriggled as Sol Jihu shook his head side to side with his teeth gently biting down.
"You cute little rice cakes." Sol Jihu didn't stop there and tickled the fuzzball until it burst into laughter. Caking. Who told you to be this cute, huh? Who told you? Caking."
As the rice cake groaned, its friends jumped in to save their friend.
Sol Jihu giggled. He felt relaxed and at peace for the first time in a while.
By the time he knocked down Harem, Heya, and the 6 puppy-like beastmen with his devilish tickling.
"I see you're having fun." A familiar voice rang out. Sol Jihu turned around and saw a woman wearing a thick coat and smoking a cigarette. It was Chinzia. "Aw! It's Leopard Witch." Harem pointed at Chinzia in a startle. Chinzia raised her eyebrow. "What did you say, Foxman brat? Run! She's going to skin us and make us into her underwear."
Harem and Heya escaped while giggling.
The group of white and yellow rice cakes hurriedly ran as well.
"Those damned brats,"
Chinzia murmured as she saw their little wagging tails getting farther away.
She shook her head, then spoke. "Did you just wake up?"
"Why yes. And you're already forming connections."
"Why don't you rest a bit, Representative Sol?" "Connections?"
They're children."
"They're children, but not just any children." Chinzia smiled languidly. The child of the Beastman King was among them too. "You didn't know?" "It was the whitest one." "It's a little hard to tell because of the brat's age. But black stripes will start appearing on the brat soon."
Chinzia snorted casually, then puffed out a cloud of smoke.
Her expression was slightly complicated.
Sol Ji-hoo tilted his head in confusion before carefully asking, "Are you okay, Miss Chinzia?"
"If you're talking about my physical well-being, then I'm perfectly fine. Otherwise, I would be blacked out in the medical relief station. I went on a little walk and thought I should see the world tree."
Chinzia spoke indifferently before glancing at Sol Ji-hoo.
"Why do you ask?"
"Oh,
well, you looked a little feeble."
Chinzia didn't reply and smoked quietly.
The way she dropped her head slightly and puffed out cloud after cloud of smoke, it looked like she was hesitating about something. Eventually, Chinzia opened her mouth. The star of pride died. Sol Ji-hoo's heightened mood died down instantly.
"I'm talking about the executor of Superbia.
He died in this war.
Quite unfortunate since he was a decent guy."
"How?" Sung Shi-hyun sneak attacked him. Sol Ji-hoo's eyes turned sharp once Sung Shi-hyun's name was mentioned.
"Speaking of which, I heard you met him?"
"Yes." "How was he?"
"Kind of an annoying guy, if I'm being honest." "His character, yes. But what do you think about his strength?" Sol Ji-hoo closed his mouth. Interpreting this silence on her own, Chinzia smiled bitterly. His conduct was never good, but he became a legend among Earthlings because of his strength. Just that. Well, he's a traitor now. Chinzia let loose a long sigh mixed with smoke. But let's look on the bright side. If he had mixed in with humanity while hiding the fact that he turned coat. It's terrible just thinking about it. We might have to be content that it ended with only the Star of Pride's death. Speaking in a bored voice, Chinzia pulled out the cigarette from her mouth and flicked it away. As she took out another cigarette, a branch of the world tree picked up the cigarette butt and threw it back at her. Talk. Chinzia's mouth twitched after being hit by the cigarette butt. This damned world tree. Just as she was about to duke it out with the world tree, she saw Sol Ji-hoo, whose complexion had turned dark. Should you be worrying about others right now? Chinzia muttered with a heavy breath. Valhalla suffered heavy damage, didn't it? Sol Ji-hoo's eyes widened. Asterisk. Sol Ji-hoo ran. He raced to the tent as soon as he heard what happened. I'm talking about the Star of Lust and that female magician. That magician was writhing in pain as soon as the war ended. I checked her out for a bit. Her body was boiling like molten metal because of her mana going berserk. The Star of Lust is in an even worse condition. The scar left behind from the Valley War seems to have burst. I heard she vomited out blood at least a dozen times and even had a seizure. It must be the price of risking death and overusing holy power. Unfortunately, the world tree that is in the middle world is only an avatar. It was created to purify contaminated earth and protect the fortress from the parasites, so it doesn't have all of the authorities that its true body has. And because the Sky Fairies used their last remaining elixir to save you in the last war. There was no way to treat her in Tiggle Fortress, so she was sent off to Eva's temple yesterday in haste. Kazuki and Philip Muller went with her as guards. Chinzia told him where Valhalla's tent was. There was nothing Sol Ji-hoo could do now that Seo Yuhui had already left for Eva, but he ran anyway. For now, he planned to contact Kazuki. And if possible, he planned to leave Tiggle Fortress and chase after Seo Yuhui immediately. He was prepared to return the life force he received last time if it could save her. But the moment he neared the vicinity of the tent, he came to a sudden stop. There was a woman leaning against the tree who stood straight as soon as she laid eyes on him. He was familiar with her face. Miss Baek Haiju? She sauntered toward him as if she had something to say. Miss Baek Haiju, by any chance? It was then. Just as Sol Ji-hoo was about to ask her, Baek Haiju glanced left and right before reaching into her pocket and taking something out. A small note was in her hand. Sol Ji-hoo took the note when she waved her hand a couple of times. This is a message from Miss Seo Yuhui.
At that moment, her mental transmission rang inside his head.
She asked me to give this to you without telling anyone else.
Yuhui Nuna said that? She also told me to tell you that she used the souvenir you gave her and that you shouldn't worry.
She asked you to read the note and keep the contents to yourself. Sol Jihu raised his eyes in a daze.
Baek Haiju was staring at him with an emotionless face. This is perfect. Everyone inside the tent is sleeping and there is no one around.
You should read it now and burn it.
His confusion at her sudden words only lasted a moment. Soon, Sol Jihu looked around carefully and opened up the note.
Chapter 349. The contents of the note were simple. There was only a single line written on it.
The day we meet again, I will blink at you 3 times when enemies are around us.
Sol Jihu's expression changed suddenly.
Worry and concern disappeared, and the sense of urgency in his mind subsided.
Instead, questions emerged. He couldn't make heads or tails of this note.
What does this mean?
I don't know. I didn't read it.
Baek Haiju replied monotonously before continuing.
Only, I thought Miss Seo Yuhui overused holy power during the Valley War and bore significant consequences from it.
Yes, all to save me.
But didn't she recover to an extent after that? Sol Jihu took his eyes off the note and stared at Baek Haiju. She offered regular prayers, and more importantly, I was told you acquired several high-quality offerings for her to help regain her strength.
Nuna said that?
Yes. I heard from Miss Seo Yuhui personally, and that's what the people around me know as well.
Sol Jihu was taken aback. Strictly speaking, this was the truth. Seo Yuhui offered prayers whenever she had time, and it was also true that he obtained a large number of high-quality offerings from the Pagoda of Dreams expedition. However, those weren't enough to fully heal Seo Yuhui.
At least, that was what Sol Jihu heard from Seo Yuhui.
She didn't say anything else?
He asked Baek Haiju in case she knew anything, but she shook her head.
Sol Jihu fell into thought.
Moirai's souvenir. A divine object with enough holy power to heal Seo Yuhui in one go. Sol Jihu had obtained this item from the neutral zone through Un Yuri, and he kept it a secret from everyone and gave it to Seo Yuhui as a surprise gift on their way back to Eva. Right, when he was the only one who was with Seo Yuhui. He clearly remembered it as he couldn't go all the way because of Un Yuri's untimely interruption after waking up in the middle of the night. He didn't put much thought into the item after that, thinking she would use it on her own. And that was what was weird. Let me think about this again. What people around her knew was that she had recovered enough to join the expedition while not being back to her full strength. But the reality was that she had Moirai's souvenir. In other words, the story of the scar from the Valley War bursting was likely Seo Yuhui's self-fabricated plot. Chinzia said she was in a grave condition, but Seo Yuhui might have hurt herself to put on an act. But why? Sol Jihu couldn't figure out the reason. It couldn't have been because she wanted attention, but to stage such a thing was still strange. Hold on, come to think of it. Oh right, have you fully recovered? I'm still holding on to Moirai's souvenir. Ah! You haven't used it yet. To tell you the truth, there's something I want to do. But given the circumstances, it looks like I should recover my strength. Was it when he asked if she could bring Baek Haiju? Sol Jihu narrowed his eyes, recalling the conversation from that day. Right. There had to be a reason. A reason that Seo Yuhui chose to stage a grave injury right after the war ended. Moreover, Sol Jihu trusted Seo Yuhui. Although he couldn't figure out what she was planning, even if it did not benefit him, it would most certainly not hurt him. Why? Baek Haiju asked as Sol Jihu organized his thoughts. Was her love confession written on it or something? Sol Jihu shot his head up. When he furrowed his brows and asked, "Ha?" Baek Haiju nodded her head while observing him carefully. Then, she turned away, murmuring quietly, I was just kidding.
You looked really serious. She knows how to make jokes?
Sol Ji-hoo murmured inwardly before giving a bland smile. He then roused his mana and burned the note in his hand. Although he received the note, he still called through the communication crystal. Seo Yuhui aside, he was worried about Un Yuri. I heard some things from the queen, but still.
He didn't realize during the war, but Un Yuri had apparently performed incredibly to the point that it was hard to believe that she was a magician who just left the neutral zone. Supposedly, she was the one who stopped Vulgar Chastity from destroying the World Tree's avatar a moment before the group returned from the spirit realm. It wasn't until recently that he heard how much Un Yuri wanted to help him and how she got both Russell and Charlotte Arya to help out.
Moving the steel of evaluation to Tiggle Fortress, materializing the dream world in the middle world, and having Russell manifest in Un Yuri's body using the astral world. Sol Ji-hoo was surprised when he heard the explanation, but he felt grateful more than anything else. At the same time, he felt it wasn't a waste to have revived Un Yuri with a divine wish. Her idea and performance certainly proved why she was called humanity's last hope. The only problem was that she used several unique rank spells that put a heavy burden on her body. Sol Ji-hoo was relieved after hearing that she woke up and went back to sleep. With how much Russell cherished Un Yuri, she must have kept her usage of mana in check so that it wouldn't risk taking Un Yuri's life. After checking on the members inside the tent, Sol Ji-hoo went to the medical relief station. He wanted to check up on the people who helped selflessly in this war. Thankfully, no one that he knew was gravely injured to the point of almost losing their life. Not among people, at least. Sol Ji-hoo looked down at the bedridden, groaning little chick.
"What are ya looking at?"
Little chick chirped curtly.
It seemed it at least had the energy to talk. "Are you alright? Do I look alright? Didn't you evolve into a phoenix?"
Isn't it obvious that it was a temporary thing? I told you it was only possible because we were in the spirit realm.
Did you? Do you think I can evolve just by consuming power?
I forced myself to do so.
For you.
Little chick flapped its wings violently and yelled out in anger.
If only you knew how to fight properly.
I wouldn't have had the need to do that. Do you know what price I paid to unlock the Spear of Purity to its third stage? Sol Ji-hoo dropped his head in disappointment.
Then, when did you go back to normal? After the enemy boss appeared.
Little chick mumbled in a disgruntled voice. I had been pushing myself ever since I started fighting that dragon. Maintaining my evolved form after coming to the middle world was definitely pushing it. I tried to endure, but the sky suddenly flipped over and I couldn't focus anymore. Little chick sighed and then turned its body.
So when you return to the city, go to the temple and fill me up with holy power.
I'm in a sorry state right now. Alright, rest up. Thanks. Sol Ji-hoo stroked little chick a couple of times while vowing to feed it with holy power until it was full.
Why wouldn't he?
Little chick helped him out a great deal, after all. Asterisk. The land devastated by the war quickly returned to its former appearance.
The medical relief station that had been busy for several days gradually settled down, and the parasites showed no signs of wanting to invade again. Around this time, the human forces began their preparations to go back. They couldn't stay at the fortress forever when the war had ended.
Of course, the Federation didn't just send them off.
That night, a party was held at Tiggle Fortress. It was to celebrate the Federation and humanity uniting to defeat the parasites for the first time ever. Before the festival started, Sol Ji-hoo was invited by the higher-ups of the Federation. It was a place to thank the hero who achieved many great things for the Federation and also to discuss plans for the future. 5 Federation members were waiting for Sol Ji-hoo at the fortress. Sol Ji-hoo was familiar with 3 of them. Gabriel, who was the head of the fallen angels, Uiril, who was the commander of the cave fairies, and the beastman King White Tiger, who chased after the parasite queen with him in the war. The head of the 2 fairies couldn't come today. Afinu and Diffidum Odor were reverse summoned back to the spirit realm, so she isn't in the best condition right now. Gabriel spoke as she looked at Yu-jin and a sky fairy.
So I called the fairy generals. I hope you don't mind. Of course not. Good. I'm sure there are a couple of new faces.
I'll introduce them to you. This here is Vidalif.
He is the ruler of the dwarven race.
A short, stocky old man smiled brightly. What made him stand out from other dwarves was that he didn't have a beard and also that his eyes were completely white.
For the record, he is the one who invented thunder. He was born blind, but his craftsmanship is a league above that of any other dwarf. He's a master among masters, if you will. Sol Jihu was surprised hearing that he invented thunder.
Vidalif smiled and reached his hand toward Sol Jihu. As Sol Jihu carefully took his hand, he felt the hard calluses on Vidalif's hand and a strong grip. Shortly afterward, Vidalif let go of Sol Jihu's hand and took out a box with a respectful attitude.
This is… Take it.
Gabriel smiled. This is our gift to the hero who sweated blood and tears for us.
Vidalif made it himself, so you won't be disappointed.
You didn't have to.
Unlike his mouth, his body was honest. Sol Jihu was already holding the box in his hands.
An item made by the dwarf king who was said to be a master among masters.
How could he not be excited? Thank you.
I'll take good care of it.
Of course, he didn't forget to thank them. Vidalif replied with a lukewarm smile. Moving on. This here is the general in command of the Sky Fairies.
Hello, I'm Taihi Ingraria. It is my greatest honor to thank you on behalf of my race.
We cannot thank you enough for reviving the World Tree and even liberating Lord Afinu Odor.
The Sky Fairy with an alluring neckline curtsied elegantly and spoke in a slightly flushed, silvery voice. The clarity of her voice made it pleasant to hear, and the snow-white skin tone in her beautiful eyes gave off the feeling of striking beauty. We should be thanking our benefactor according to our customs, but unfortunately we are all out of elixirs. As Taihi placed her hand on her chest in a show of apology, Sol Jihu quickly shook his head.
It's fine. I'm already grateful for the one you gave before. No, we can't possibly forget about this matter like that.
So I was thinking. Why don't you stop there? A sour voice cut in.
Yu-jin was picking her ear with an apathetic look. Taihi furrowed her brows.
Stop what? Do I even need to explain?
You were probably going to ask him to marry you and receive the blessing of the spirits. Can you be more obvious?
Why don't you think about your age a bit?
What was SHTAT?
When did I say it had to be MWE? Taihi got angry. But not caring for it in the slightest, Yu-jin's amber eyes curled charmingly and turned to Sol Jihu.
Listen, friend.
If you can get the same effect anyway, why not choose me?
Aren't you saying the same thing?
Shut up for a bit. Friend, you should decide well.
We cave fairies are fundamentally different from sky fairies.
We're honest and pure, unlike the lustful, messy race that enjoys being captured by orcs and falling into depravity.
I'm a bit of a romanticist myself. What was SHTAT? Did you just call us a lustful race that enjoys falling into depravity? Stop slurring your speech. And please, doesn't history prove that I'm right?
So you want to play this guame?
The two fairies grew tense.
White Tiger, the Beastman King, who was watching from the sidelines, spoke while rubbing his chin.
Come to think of it, I have a daughter myself. She is still in her infancy, but our race normally grows quickly.
How about it?
If you wait a month, she will be more than ready to.
Sol Jihu closed his eyes.
Just dealing with Teresa was hard enough. Now, he even had more to handle on his hands. Not to mention, he couldn't understand just what they would benefit from marrying him. Of course, this was only because he had never put much thought into their culture or the value of his position. That's enough. In the end, Gabriel couldn't bear to watch any longer and intervened. Did we invite Representative Sol today to find him a marriage partner?
Knowing the hidden meaning in her words, the other leaders fell silent. Gabriel sighed and then changed the topic.
I know you must be tired of hearing this, but I want to thank you again. You performed fantastically. We wouldn't be here arguing if you didn't perform above and beyond our wildest imaginations. It wasn't as if I was alone. But you were the one who planned and executed the expedition.
And unlike the time with undying diligence, you were able to retrieve Temperance's divinity after exterminating raging Temperance.
Words cannot describe just how incredible that is. Gabriel smiled brightly, then clapped her hands. And with that, the parasites lost the Great War, and peace returned to paradise. I would kill for such a happy ending, but unfortunately, you should know that we aren't anywhere close to that, right?
Sol Jihu nodded silently. The parasites had suffered a tremendous defeat, but they were not eliminated completely.
The parasite queen was still alive, and so were most of the army commanders. Although they shouldn't be able to recover in a short period of time, the nature of parasites meant they would recoup the numbers they lost relatively quickly. Moreover, the fact that Sung Shi-hyun defected to the parasites is something we cannot ignore. To be honest, it was incredibly shocking. Right, there was that guy too. Sol Jihu grimaced. But a victory is still a victory. The parasites will need some time to recover, and we need to make use of this time as much as possible. What do you think about attacking the parasites? You mean invading the empire? Yes, that's where the queen is, right? The parasites should be at their weakest right now, so it's our best chance to attack. Is that what you want to say? Unfortunately, that isn't such a good idea. For 3 reasons. Gabriel took a brief pause, then raised her index, middle, and ring fingers. First, as much as the parasites have weakened, we have weakened too. Do you know that the 2 spirit lords, the 5 spirit kings, and all spirits were reverse summoned because of the queen? Ah! They returned to the spirit realm, but we'll need some time before we can summon them again. Gabriel cleared her throat and continued. Second, the empire is the parasite's territory. One of the biggest reasons we triumphed in this war was the presence of the World Tree. It blocks the parasite's infestation and greatly limits the parasite's power, including the queens and the army commanders. But, the World Tree's influence only reaches this surrounding area. In other words, they would not be able to receive the World Tree's blessing in the Empire's territory. The moment we enter the Empire, our positions will reverse. We will be afflicted by all sorts of disadvantageous effects. The parasite queen and the army commanders will be able to use their full power as well, so that's something we need to consider. If you can't quite wrap your mind around it, just think of them as having 4 or 5 corrupted world trees. Sol Jihu groaned unwittingly. 4 or 5 corrupted world trees? Just imagining it gave him a gloomy feeling. As for the third and final reason, Gabriel began to speak carefully. If we decide to bear the previous 2 conditions and attack, it's pretty much guaranteed that it will need to be an all-out attack. I'll be straightforward. Even though the situation is a lot better than in the past and is continually getting better, if you ask me whether humans will really agree to an all-out attack, then I'm going to have to say no. For now, anyway. Sol Jihu became lost for words. He couldn't refute her statement. Even in this war, Eva and Harem were the only cities that helped fully. The other 3 cities that participated were only saving face, and 2 cities did not even participate. Moreover, the way Earthlings viewed paradise had yet to change. So rather than attacking the Empire, which has a high probability of failing, I suggest we do something more worthwhile. Something more worthwhile? Yep. Something that will benefit us both. I'll be straight. I think you should use the time that this war bought us to regroup humanity. Regroup humanity. Sol Jihu became dazed hearing something he didn't expect at all. Do you want to at least hear me out? Sol Jihu nodded quickly. Gabriel grinned and turned her gaze to where the dwarf king was sitting. Soon,
The smiling, white-eyed old man, Vidalov, opened his wrinkly mouth.
Chapter 350.
Their conversation lasted longer than he expected, and the celebration was already underway when he got out.
There were groups of people, some small and some large, scattered all over the vast fortress. Everyone was laughing, drinking, and enjoying themselves. When he turned his eyes to a particularly loud spot, he saw people of various races rolling on the ground, laughing. At the center of their attention was Hoshino Urara. And Kwa.
The beam hit her hard, and she stumbled like this. She wobbled as she mimicked twisted kindness being attacked by raging temperance. They seemed to be talking about the battle she fought in the spirit realm.
She's an interesting person, Gabriel muttered.
Sol Jihu didn't respond. His mind was still occupied with the unexpected proposal he'd received a moment ago. Gabriel asked as they slowly entered the scene of the festival.
Are you uncomfortable? No, that's not it.
Sol Jihu said after a moment of reflection. I think it's a generous offer.
Humanity does need to change. Perhaps the word, revolution, would be more fitting.
Some earthlings might think the plan is too radical.
Isn't that what you're worried about?
It's not that I'm worried, but I actually have a question. What is it?
Do ask.
Is it okay? It's about the fallen angels. Us?
Now that interests me even more.
I heard the fallen angels are foreign to paradise, just like the parasites.
Gabriel almost stopped but managed to keep walking.
How did the fallen angels end up in paradise?
Gabriel smiled bitterly. Ah.
This is why you should never make a promise when you're in a good mood,
she said in a vaguely regretful tone and glanced at Sol Jihu.
It's not exactly a secret, but do you really want to know?
Yes. Personally, I've always wondered about it. I see. I guess I don't have any choice. It's a bit of a long story.
Are you okay with that? Sol Jihu nodded. Gabriel gave a deep sigh and licked her lips. Where should I start? After a moment of silence, she continued. Once upon a time, there was a great war. To put it simply, it was a war between the angels and the demons.
Her voice was full of regret. Sol Jihu listened to the narrative silently.
It was a devastating war, where authorities like the one the parasite queen used yesterday were ubiquitous.
The two sides fought fiercely for a long time.
But in the end, the demons triumphed over the angels. The angels retreated to their sanctuary, their home, the celestial realm, and began plotting revenge. At the same time, the demons tried to invade the celestial realm in order to seal their victory.
It was the beginning of a whole new war. What the angels came up with then was summoning proxies.
They had to protect the celestial realm no matter what, but they themselves lacked the power to do so.
So they forcefully summoned proxies to fight for them.
Proxies?
Sol Jihu tilted his head curiously. The word, forcefully, bothered him.
What do you think? Suddenly, Gabriel turned to him and asked.
Let's say you've just been discharged from the army. You're so happy to finally go home and you fall asleep on the train.
Then, when you open your eyes again, you're in a whole new world, against your will.
Forced into a situation where there's no dream or hope, fighting against the demons as a proxy for the angels, unable to return home and barely surviving every day. What would he think of the ones who put himself in such a situation? Sol Jihu's face unwittingly warped into a heavy frown. Son of a bitch. He immediately regretted saying it out loud, but the water had already spilled. But he meant what he said. To be summoned forcefully on the day of his discharge. Sol Jihu felt sorry for that guy, whoever he was. Son of a bitch. Yes, the angels must have been exactly that. From martial God's perspective, that is. Gabriel didn't seem to mind Sol Jihu's harsh words. And those sons of bitches soon paid the price. Price? Yes. At one point, one proxy became ridiculously powerful. His power was enough to threaten not only the angels but also the demons. Ooh. Hey, you. Never mind.
Anyway, that proxy quickly climbed to the top and began pursuing a vendetta against the angels and the demons. He and his followers first invaded Infernal Realm, the home of the demons, and then the Celestial Realm, the home of the angels.
I see. For the record, the Infernal Realm surrendered immediately without putting up a fight. Gabriel snorted. It was pathetic, really. They begged him. Wasn't killing the 7 archdemons and 14 demon lords enough?
We're victims, too.
Please spare our lives. We'll do anything. We can even become your dogs.
Well, the martial god bought it, and he accepted their surrender under certain conditions. And the Celestial Realm?
Destroyed.
Gabriel answered simply. However, contrary to her tone, her face was grim.
We sent him a formal apology, and he replied by sending us a short letter and the head of the angel we'd sent as a messenger.
The letter said,
what was it again? Demons, I can forgive. But you, never. Something like that. Then.
That's right.
The martial god invaded the celestial realm. Using infernal flames and the infernal army, he destroyed everything and captured all angels. He even brought the angels who fell in battle back to life.
Gabriel bit her lower lip.
And then, the martial god threw all the angels he captured into the infernal realm. He then ordered the demons to torment the angels with unimaginable pain and humiliation. He didn't want the demons to kill us. He wanted us to suffer forever.
He told the demons that he would decide whether or not to accept their surrender, depending on how well they carry out his orders.
And then what happened?
What do you think? Gabriel answered curtly. That's when hell began. After untold torture and humiliation, we angels fell from grace, and judging from her expression, it couldn't have been a thrilling experience.
Gabriel continued hesitantly.
What could we have done? We became slaves to the demons whom we despised so much, until one day we were given a chance.
Chance? Paradise. Gabriel pointed at the sky, and then at the earth.
You see, there was actually an angel who turned over to the martial god's side before all of this happened.
I guess she took pity on us and begged the martial god
to forgive you?
Not quite. She probably asked him to give us another chance.
Well, they seemed like a happy couple, so I'm guessing he couldn't ignore her request.
A chance. Sol Jihu thought for a moment and then said, no way.
The corner of Gabriel's mouth slanted upward. That's right.
The martial god robbed us of all our authorities and power and then mentioned paradise.
He told us that the parasite queen was disturbing the peace of this planet and ordered us to take care of her.
At least that's what he said.
He probably just wanted us to suffer the same pain he did.
Gabriel stopped moving. And so we came to this planet by force. She looked up at the stars in the night sky and shrugged her shoulders.
That's the end of my story. What do you think? Sol Jihu was speechless. In truth, he had hoped for a fairy tale-like story in which a righteous alien race helped humans fight against the evil atrocities of the parasite queen. But the reality was far beyond his imagination. Don't feel sorry for us. Like I told you, we're just paying for what we've done.
Gabriel emphasized. What's important is that we fallen angels have no choice but to help paradise.
We're going to do everything we can to grab the chance given to us, even if it was the martial god's empty words.
I'd rather bite off my tongue and kill myself than become the demon's slave again.
Sol Jihu nodded slowly.
I see. You're definitely on our side. Yes.
We're both fighting this war for the survival of our people, so you don't have to worry about betrayal.
Earthlings are an exception, but maybe that'll change after tonight.
Gabriel smacked her lips and shook her head, to indicate she didn't want to talk on this subject anymore.
Well then.
Gabriel cast a quick glance about the fortress and gave an enigmatic smile. Now that I've satisfied your curiosity, I'd like to go enjoy the festival.
Will you be all right without me? Since yesterday, you've become a hero to the Federation. I'm sure there isn't a soul in this fortress that doesn't know your name."
Sol Jihu tilted his head.
He still wasn't sure what she wanted to say.
Some races may want to express their gratitude in their own way. They don't mean any harm, that's just their culture. So don't think too badly of them. Gabriel left with the same enigmatic smile.
Though clueless at first, Sol Jihu quickly came to a realization. He noticed a strange presence nearby.
A number of foreign races were surrounding him.
First he saw a group of beauties led by a foxman with foxy eyes and a voluptuous figure.
He then saw the little brats, including Hario and Heya.
The group of white and yellow rice cakes was also joyfully wagging their tails at him.
They were all waiting thirstily for a chance to talk to him.
"Hello." The foxman beauty was the first to speak. Blushing coyly, she approached him with a smile on her face.
"If it's not too much trouble, could you come with us for a moment?"
"Wait tilde, hold on tilde." It was then that pink-colored hair fluttered before Sol Jihu's eyes.
Suddenly, Teresa came out of nowhere. She seemed to have been following him for a while.
The foxman beauty gave a small frown.
"Who are you?"
"Teresa Hussey, the Princess of Haremark,"
said Teresa confidently as she placed her hand on Sol Jihu's shoulder.
"And this man right here is the royal son to the king of Haremark."
"That means he's the king's son-in-law."
"And I'm Haremark's only princess.
Do you understand now?
When did I become the king's son-in-law?"
Sol Jihu turned to Teresa with a puzzled look.
The foxman beauty seemed perplexed as well.
"And?
What do you mean, and?"
"He's married, is what I'm saying."
"I think you misunderstood. We just want to talk to him."
"Oh, come on.
Quit playing games. You and I both know better."
"Sure. It starts out with just talking, but then one thing leads to another, and suddenly you're moaning under him."
Teresa folded her arms.
"I respect your culture, and I'd like for you to respect ours. Where he comes from, monogamy is the law. If you sleep with a woman who isn't your wife, you're criticized by your peers and even punishable by law. Surely you don't want anything bad to happen to the Federation's hero, do you?"
Teresa said all this very quickly, as if not to give her a chance to refute.
Baffled, the foxman beauty failed to find the right words and shut her mouth.
Tisk.
Finally she clicked her tongue and turned around, and the rest of the beauty corps left with her in regret. HMPH.
Teresa watched them leave, her eyes full of contempt. She then glanced sideways.
"Hey, guys.
You heard me, right?"
She threw the little ones a gentle smile and waved them away with an impatient gesture.
"Pooh! Pink hag."
Hario, Heya, and the rest of the little ones left sulking.
Keying.
The group of white rice cakes and yellow rice cakes also turned away with a grunt.
"Those brats.
What do they know?"
Teresa snorted and took Sol Jihu's hand in hers as he stood dazed. "What took you so long?"
"What did you guys talk about?"
"Stuff. Important stuff.
I'll tell you later."
"Did the fairies ask you to marry them in exchange for the blessing of the spirits?" "Oh. They did, but Gabriel turned them down for me." "Good. Now Haremark will ally with the fallen angels." Teresa pulled Sol Jihu's hand and began to walk.
"Princess? Where are we going?" "To somewhere where there isn't any trouble." "Okay, but why are you holding a knife?" "Mr. Sol Jihu.
Clearly you have no idea how dangerous this situation is.
The Federation, especially the Cave Fairies and the Beastmen Association, are not the type to plan ahead. They just go for it."
"Go for it?"
"That's right. Didn't you see it earlier?"
"They were basically throwing themselves at you."
Teresa opened her eyes wide, keeping a lookout, and Sol Jihu looked back regretfully. The truth was,
I wanted to try chewing on them again.
He regretted not being able to play with the mochi like fuzzballs.
Asterisk.
The next morning, humanity left Tiggle Fortress.
They began the long journey home and the Federation saw them off.
Just before they set off, however, there was a small incident in which the World Tree grabbed Sol Jihu and refused to let go. Some then demanded humanity to leave Sol Jihu behind, and the situation almost turned into a fight. But in the end, everything worked out well and Sol Jihu was released and set out on his way to Eva.
But there was one thing he left behind. He decided to place the stele of evaluation from the Pagoda of Dreams next to the World Tree. It was done, of course, with Russell's consent.
Sol Jihu asked her in his dream and Russell readily agreed.
The Federation had no reason to decline.
Russell would be a great asset to the Federation should the parasites attempt to invade Tiggle Fortress again. Their bodies were tired from the fierce battle, but their steps were as light as a feather. Everyone was agog with excitement. This was their first major victory against the parasites. Their pace naturally quickened, and before they knew it, Eva was just around the corner. That night, humanity stopped within a day's distance to Eva and set up camp in the woods. Everyone gathered around the fire and a lively conversation ensued. The main topic of discussion was contribution points. Judging from everything that had happened, it seemed clear that many people would be promoted to high rankers.
Sol Jihu also had high expectations. Level 6 is a given. I could probably shoot for level 7, too. Maybe they'll let me skip the test as well. He had long dreamed of becoming a unique ranker. He worried that the excitement and anticipation would keep him awake at night. And his prediction became a reality. After hours of tossing and turning, Sol Jihu crawled out of his tent. He couldn't sleep, and he was feeling hungry. He wanted a quick snack before going back to bed. The campsite was silent. Because he was traveling with an army, he didn't have to worry about keeping a night watch. Wondering what to eat, Sol Jihu inadvertently turned his gaze to the side. It was then that he noticed a woman, dressed in a white traditional robe, leaning back against a tree with her eyes closed. "Miss Baek Haiju?" Baek Haiju opened her eyes slightly, and their eyes met. "Why aren't you sleeping?" The woman bowed her head slightly without saying a word. She closed her eyes again. It didn't seem like she was sleeping. She just seemed lost in thought. She's a strange one. Looking at Baek Haiju's expressionless face, Sol Jihu gave a small sigh. Often, she seemed emotionless, but she would sometimes casually call his name or even joke around during battles. And then, it was back to this again. She would become as quiet as she was now. In fact, today, Sol Jihu and several others tried striking up a conversation with her all during the trip, but Baek Haiju barely said a word back. Because of her seemingly cold demeanor, she was often seen alone than with a group of people. Although, she seemed perfectly content with her situation. Still, I'm grateful to her. Sol Jihu concluded. He then hummed to himself as he took out the black belt he had received from Teresa. Ramen is the best late-night snack. Ever since he suffered from hunger and thirst during the Delphinian Duchy laboratory escape, he had made a habit of stockpiling food. Belt infused with preservation magic was undoubtedly the best place to store food. La la la, ramen, la 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 la. Sol Jihu hummed as he made a fire and took out ramen and bottled water. Water boils between 97 degrees Celsius and 99 degrees Celsius. It has to be exactly 550 milliliters. Wait, I think I poured a little more. And now I wait exactly 4 minutes. He put in more effort than usual. Sol Jihu's lips curved into a smile as he watched the noodles cook to a perfect yellow. The soft boiled egg on top of the ramen made his mouth water. Thank you for the food. Sol Jihu prayed with his hands together before picking up the chopsticks. Who? He cut the egg in half and grabbed it with the noodles. After blowing on the steaming noodles, he slowly brought it to his open mouth. It was then. Who? Sol Jihu blinked curiously. A shadow was cast over the bonfire that had just been lit. He looked back unwittingly, and
Baek Haiju, who had been sitting under a tree, was suddenly standing next to him.
Her eyes were fixed on the ramen, and not Sol Ji-hoo.
Miss Baek Haiju? Baek Haiju didn't answer.
She just stood there staring at the ramen.
Her nostrils flared slightly from the ramen's spicy aroma.
Standing there with an expressionless face, she looked a little scary.
It might just be his imagination, but she was giving off an intense aura. Does she want the ramen? Sol Ji-hoo scratched his head.
He was kind of surprised. He hadn't asked because he thought she would decline.
Ah!
Confused, Sol Ji-hoo handed over the chopsticks in his hand to Baek Haiju. Would you like to have some? Baek Haiju's eyes turned to the chopsticks.
She gave Sol Ji-hoo a quick glance and then stared at the ramen again.
Gulp. The sound of her swallowing resounded in the air.